Today's program is devoted to a very serious subject. The conflict that began in Ukraine has been expanding and involving more and more countries. Russia, Europe, the United States. Wherever you live in the world, you've probably heard about this. But you might start to become affected by it if the conflict grows. Some people believe that it might be the start of World War III. And unlike the first two world wars, this one could involve nuclear weapons, an exchange between the two largest nuclear stockpiles in the world, those of Russia and the United States. Hopefully, it won't get to that point, but this presentation is about exploring how it came about, the history of the conflict, and what each of the players were doing and why they reacted the way they did. If you're interested in hearing more than just one side of the story, if you're listening and you're curious about what happened and how did different groups react, then keep watching. In the second half of this program, we're going to have Noam Chomsky, and we're going to have a discussion about the war as it's going today. Before I begin, I do want to mention an eerie coincidence that people discovered back in March or even in February. The dates of World War I and World War II and World War III potentially might have something in common. World War I started officially on July 28, 1914. You could see it here. If you sum up 7, 28, 19, and 14, you get 68. Now, World War II officially started September 1st, 1939. And again, if you sum up 9, 1, 1939, you also get 68. The eerie part is that Russia's invasion of Ukraine took place and started on February 24th, 2022. And if you sum these numbers, they also sum to 68. And some people believe there's some kind of weird numerological coincidence here, and it gives them more reason to believe that this invasion is just the start of World War III. Hopefully not. And one most important thing is to understand the other side, understand other people in other countries, and try to come to a compromise. Unfortunately, today, this is not happening. Back when we had a nuclear scare during the Cuban Missile Crisis that was averted, it was averted by John F. Kennedy and Nikita Khrushchev, leaders of the United States and at that time the USSR. Now, there was a lot dividing those two countries, perhaps more than today. After all, the USSR was a communist country. They had a completely different outlook on what the economic system should be. The United States and the USSR had engaged in a Cold War for many years and almost came to huge escalation, to perhaps nuclear war. After averting it, this was Kennedy's speech, and I want to start here. Here's what Kennedy said at an address. This was a speech that, in fact, was heard by Khrushchev, and within months, the United States and Russia had established a direct line, had started to draw down a lot of their weapons, and in fact, worked on helping normalize relations, all because of this speech. Let's listen.
So let us not be blind to our differences, but let us also direct attention to our common interests and the means by which those differences can be resolved. And if we cannot end now our differences, at least we can help make the world safe for diversity.
Now, this is his famous phrase here.
For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures, and we are all mortal. Third, let us re-examine our attitude towards the Cold War, remembering we're not engaged in a debate, seeking to pile up debating points. We are not here distributing blame or pointing the finger of judgment.
I do want to contrast what he's saying with what's happening today. Are we pointing blame? What's more important to us? De-escalation and peace efforts, or blaming and escalating today? What is the end goal? Listen to what Kennedy said back then, the man who helped avert a nuclear crisis back then.
We must deal with the world as it is, and not as it might have been, had the history of the last 18 years been different. We must therefore persevere in the search for peace, in the hope that constructive changes within the communist bloc might bring within reach solutions which now seem beyond us. We must conduct our affairs in such a way that it becomes in the communist interest to agree on a genuine peace, and above all, while defending our own vital interests.
Above all, he says,
nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war. To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world.
So Kennedy warned about pushing an adversary to essentially a choice, either a humiliating defeat, 100% defeat, or nuclear war. Today's policy seems to be to push Russia to 100% defeat. Russia, 100% defeated. This is pretty much the only outcome that would be accepted by the United States. It's also the outcome that Ukraine wants, of course. But when asked, what is the end game? How long will we be participating as the United States? The answer is, as long as it takes. So this, according to Kennedy, is a collective death wish for the world. But perhaps today's leaders can avert it in some other way. Today, we have the following headlines. American troops prepared to engage in war with Russia. This is Newsweek, a provocative headline talking about what is essentially, at this point, exercises that are taking place with allied and partner nations here. NATO exercises right outside of Russia. So this was October 26th. We see here that we're talking about essentially exercises to send a message. But also not just to send a message, but to start bringing troops there. We have here, NBC News, U.S. military inspectors in Ukraine, to keep further track of weapons and equipment. The inspectors appear to be among the first U.S. military members to officially enter Ukraine since Russia invaded. So again, will it be limited to this, or is this a growing trend? Remember, Biden said that we would not engage Russia on the ground in Ukraine because, according to him, that would be the start of World War III. Well, now, some of these things are being rethought. Bloomberg reports, recent, Pentagon's strategy has changed. It will now no longer rule out nuclear use against non-nuclear threats. Where Biden once said that there would be limits and we would only respond after someone launched a nuke, now we're not ruling out nuclear threats. This is a nuclear force against non-nuclear threats. To prevent war and further escalation, each country has to understand the reasons and motivations of the other countries. Why are they escalating? Russia's invasion of Ukraine can best be understood in light of NATO's history of expansion into Central and Eastern Europe, right up to Russia's borders now. As we're going to see in this article, and many others, a chorus of voices over the last several decades, including from very experienced and high-placed people in the US, has warned that expanding NATO and welcoming Russia's neighbors into what it considers to be a hostile military alliance would provoke Russia to take military action in order to stave off what it considers to be a future existential threat to its national security. Here is an article that talks about it. Ukraine's war follows decades of warnings that NATO expansion into Eastern Europe could provoke Russia. So when we ask, what did Ukraine do? How was this war provoked? This is an unprovoked, unjustified invasion. We have to understand that Ukraine, just like many smaller countries during the Cold War, is far less responsible than the large blocs, whether it be the NATO alliance or whether it be the Warsaw Pact. Small countries like Ukraine, Israel, Bolivia, and so forth are simply caught in the crosshairs of much larger geopolitical challenges and maneuvering. And unfortunately, whether it's US and China or whether it's US and Russia, these countries often pay the price being used for a proxy war by two much larger and heavily armed powers. So let's go through this article and kind of go through what has been said over the decades, the warnings that have been sounded very loudly, but ignored by many in the establishment who ultimately pushed NATO to expand. Joe Biden says that this was always about naked aggression, Putin's desire for empire, by any means necessary. In fact, NATO expanded in the last 20 to 30 years, starting with Clinton, getting more and more countries into the alliance. Whether it's a defensive alliance, we will look at that shortly. Russia, of course, has also fought wars near its border, including within its borders a very brutal repression of Chechnya's move for independence, as well as an invasion of Georgia that lasted 4 days. However, the scope of those was limited, and afterwards, no significant further aggression against that region or country was done. And today, for example, Georgia is existing on Russia's border with relative security, and in fact has let in people fleeing the Russian draft. So it says here, the opposing view argues that Russia's security concerns are in fact genuine. We should take other countries at their word, especially if they repeat it over and over and say that these are the main things. And that NATO expansion eastward is seen by Russians as directed against their country. In some of the speeches since 2007, Putin has asked, against which country is NATO defending? It's interesting that Putin, in fact, wanted to join NATO early on in his rule. And I'd like to briefly discuss that. This comes from the person who led NATO in those days, George Robertson. And he recalls that the Russian president did not want to wait in line with countries that don't matter. Another example of arrogance on the part of politicians. If they had simply applied to NATO the way other countries have done, such as Finland, Sweden, and indeed now Ukraine, they perhaps would have to get an official answer from NATO. The same way that when the USSR applied to NATO, they were rejected. When NATO was first formed, the Soviets tried to join, and they were rejected, going on to form their own Warsaw Pact. However, at least it was an official response, an official rejection that could be criticized. Putin, as far as I know, never formally applied. But again, one of the big problems with governments is that everything happens behind closed doors, and you then have to read tea leaves and he said, she said. So you can go ahead and read this article about George Robertson and speaking about how Putin back then was very bullish on Russia joining as many European institutions as possible. What he said was, quote, the civilized world. Since then, however, after many attempts being rebuffed of Russia being treated as an equal, and this is what he meant here. It's not just totally arrogance, but it's also the idea that Russia would need to be treated not just as a junior member state of NATO, but in fact as an equal, similarly to how it's treated on the UN Security Council, for example, as a permanent member and so forth with veto power. So since Russia would not be treated this way, Russians were afraid of imposition of things, including silly things like they're talking about gay pride parades being forced upon a country, that they must have them, and all these other things that he's saying the liberal Western countries would now impose on others. This rhetoric, plus the denazification rhetoric, obscures the main point, which is that Russia, as a country, and not simply Putin as a president, are concerned about their national security. And certainly, having a country on their border being a de facto base for NATO, enabling them to launch rockets from there, is not something that Russia would allow. Any more than, for example, Israel would allow the Golan Heights in Syria to be used to launch rockets into Israel by its neighbors. Even though it might violate international law, for Russia, its own security and that of its people takes precedence. And this is what's important to understand in realpolitik. International law is something that can exist as long as it serves the countries participating in the international community. Often for these countries, their existential threat is more important than following the letter of the law. And the law can be shaped and improved to accommodate a lot of these things. And hopefully the international community will take note, because it's not just in Russia, but in fact other places that international law, like China, for example, Brazil, where international law could constantly use improvement. But back to NATO expansion. The perspective isn't just held by Russians. Some influential American policy experts have subscribed to it as well. Among others, Biden's CIA director, the current president of the United States, the CIA director, William J. Burns, has been warning about the provocative effect of NATO expansion on Russia since 1995. Back then, Burns was a political officer in the U.S. Embassy in Moscow. He reported to Washington that hostility to early NATO expansion is almost universally felt across the domestic political spectrum here. So this is not something that is esoteric or just here and there. It is almost universally felt, and we would ignore it at our peril. This is, you can read it on govinfo.gov. NATO continues to expand east towards Russia. From a 12-nation base of the United States and Canada and key countries in Western Europe, remember this was the North Atlantic Treaty Organization, NATO started welcoming, for example, Poland and former Warsaw Pact nations. Remember, Warsaw was in Poland. So Poland, Romania, and Bulgaria. And in fact, later, even right up to Russia's border, they got the Baltic states to join. So already, Russia has NATO member states at its border. Yes, the border is smaller than it shares with Ukraine. And yes, St. Petersburg is very close to these countries, and so it would be in the immediate range of any rockets that could fly for 3 minutes. So already Russia is surrounded. So a lot of Putin's complaints are sort of too little, too late when it comes to the north part of Russia. But it seems Putin is talking about other parts of Russia and saying that, well, to defend against this on this border, as well as on this border, is something Russia does not want to have to do. Is Ukraine a de facto member of NATO? Well, according to Zelensky, Zelensky has come out recently and said that Ukraine is a de facto member of NATO now. And in applying, he wants to make it a de jure member of NATO. So the idea of neutrality that Ukraine has had for many years is now being overturned, and largely because as blowback for Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Now, within Russia, people are told that it's better to head this off early, because if Russia had waited another 10 years, then NATO would have continued to arm and train the Ukrainian army even further. And essentially, Ukraine would represent a member of a hostile alliance and perhaps start to it would be one step away from basing rockets on Russia's border. So you can see why Russia, here in red, it's always red in these war maps. I find that to be interesting that Russia almost like colors itself sort of the color of blood, or the aggressor, and China does similarly. Is that the color of communism? I don't know, but it's just interesting. The Republican Party does the same in the US. Anyway, if you're Russia, what are you most concerned about? You're not just sitting there going kumbaya, la la la, right? You don't build a country like this without worrying about what is going to happen if it ever falls apart, if it has to deal with a lot of pressure. After 1993, as I'll show, 1991, and the breakup of the Soviet Union, Russians have become extremely acutely aware of what other countries can do to their economy, including support for Boris Yeltsin and his radical shock therapy reforms that allowed all these oligarchs to basically be transferred wealth from the Russian government and state-owned properties and industries. But we'll get to that. The first and main thing is NATO edging towards Russia. North Atlantic Treaty Organization, or NATO, is a military alliance that was formed by US, Canada, and several European nations in 1949 to contain the USSR and the spread of communism. So the idea of the domino theory. The domino theory is the idea that if communism spreads to some countries, then many countries will be emboldened to try that economic system and that political setup. And that is something that the United States felt it could not allow, even if it happened 3,000 miles away in countries which did not affect the United States or did not, in fact, present any threat to it. The domino theory is kind of analogous to Putin's idea of denazification, except applied to communism instead of Nazis. The United States would see communists everywhere, including in Laos, for example, where people had overthrown a kleptocrat, similarly to how they did it in Ukraine. But Laos was actually invaded and bombed. Well, not invaded, I should say, invaded with planes. Laos was bombed more than any other country has ever been bombed in history. And it was done mostly in secret by a, quote, special military operation by U.S. President Lyndon Johnson. It was done, as you'll see, to send a message to Vietnam that communism just wouldn't expand. And the U.S. would not allow communism to expand. So when we talk about reasons for bombing or invading, it's very important to have a sense of proportion and see what other reasons have motivated, or far lesser reasons motivated other countries to commit atrocities against the civilian population. And we also need to understand that as the public, we could have a say in what happens. We don't have to re-elect George W. Bush in 2004 and so forth. Let's look at some of the things that have been said by prominent people in the United States about the consequences of NATO enlargement, as you see here. The Western view is that the Kremlin is supposed to understand and accept that the alliance's activities, among them war games, replete with American tanks staged in nearby Baltic states, rockets stationed in Poland and Romania, which the U.S. says are aimed at Iran, don't worry, that we'll never re-aim them, is in no way supposed to present a threat to Russian security. So, in other words, this meme that you have, Russia wants war meme. Have you seen this? Years ago, there was this meme that basically says, Russia wants war. Look how close they've put their country next to our military bases. This meme has been going around since 2014. And as you can see here, these are the U.S. military bases. Even outside NATO, the idea that the U.S. is the world police and has 800 military bases means that the U.S. essentially has taken upon itself the role of somewhat being above international law. Just like the police are a bit above the kind of things that civilians, if civilians did the kinds of things that police did, they would be quickly arrested. But the police are able to operate in all of these things. In fact, some of these countries, U.S. congressmen were surprised. Congress people were surprised that our army is even there and had no idea That is how extensive U.S. involvement has been around the world. So if the U.S. is in fact hosting 800 bases around the world to contain China, to contain Russia, to contain Iran, to help regions here in the Gulf, the rest of the world combined, all these other countries combined, have, I think, under 50 bases, which is more than an order of magnitude less than the United States. So countries could definitely wonder what is going on. And since the U.S. is so prominent, countries around the world, there is a poll around the world which asked, which country is the greatest threat to democracy? And every year in different countries, the U.S. was named. Now, you could say maybe that's because the U.S. is top of mind for some countries, but all the way up until 2021, the U.S. was seen as a bigger threat to democracy than Russia or China. So belief in the importance of democracy, high in 53 sampled countries, but inequality and big tech companies are seen as biggest threats. So they also look at other threats besides. But which state actor was named far and away the biggest threat was the United States. And perhaps its military bases is one of these reasons. Basically, of course, the people in Russia, including the broad public opinion, have been long opposed to this expansion. And the placement of American rockets in Poland and Romania is definitely something they don't like, especially the arming of Ukraine. So you could talk about how basically we have been arming Ukraine, we meaning the United States, but also the UK and other member states like Turkey, which gave Bayraktar drones to the Ukraine government. Bayraktar drones, as you will see, helped turn the tide of the war in Donbass in 2021 and provoked Russia also into invading. But I'll talk about that a bit later. Right now I'm talking about the large geopolitical effects. Here we have, I'm not just saying this, I'm also going to talk about Thomas Friedman, a columnist at the New York Times. And the New York Times has been saying this. Back in 1998, an interview that he had with George Kennan, the architect of the containment strategy for Russia. He said, and he was very, very worried back then. When interviewed, he was 94 years old and still sharp, just like Noam Chomsky, who I interview on this program. He said, I think it's the beginning of a new Cold War. I think the Russians will gradually react quite adversely, and it will affect their policies. I think it's a tragic mistake. There was no reason for this whatsoever. No one was threatening anybody else. This is post-Soviet Union. This expansion would make the founding fathers of this country turn over in their graves. We have signed up to protect a whole series of countries, even though we have neither the resources nor the intention to do so in any serious way. That's an interesting question of how serious the U.S. support for Ukraine is, who is not a member of NATO yet. He says, NATO expansion was simply a lighthearted action by a Senate that has no real interest in foreign affairs. What bothers me now, he says, is how superficial, ill-informed the whole Senate debate was, and so on. What's important is, here's what I wanted to say. Basically, he was talking about how we will eventually blame Russia for reacting. But it's not right, because he says that it will be reacting to something that we did, and they have begged the United States not to do. So this is something that has been echoed by many people, including the United States. In 1997, 50 prominent foreign policy experts signed an open letter to Clinton saying, we believe that the current U.S.-led effort to expand NATO is a policy error of historic proportions that would unsettle European stability. Well, this comment aged, sadly, rather well. This is an interesting one. He basically said, Burns, then the American ambassador to Moscow, in 2008, this is when President Medvedev was ruling Russia, not Putin. And Georgia was welcomed into NATO. So the Russo-Georgian War was a brief war, as I said, was basically caused, largely encouraged by Georgia being welcomed into NATO and half-heartedly supported by NATO. So what happened was with Georgia, a leader called Mikhail Saakashvili became interested in asserting more control over these breakaway regions of Abkhazia and Ossetia. Unfortunately, I can't show you the map right now. So Abkhazia and Ossetia were, in fact, parts of Georgia that considered themselves independent. Russia got involved, recognized the independence of these regions, and sent in the army to protect them, quote unquote. Very similar to what happened in Ukraine. The whole thing was over in about 4 days because France's president at the time, Nicolas Sarkozy, negotiated a peace agreement in 4 days. And Russia withdrew its troops and pretty much never bothered Georgia again. So there is precedent to those who say, what if we allow Russia to get away with their annexation of these regions? Well, initially, annexation or even regime change was not even contemplated. The idea was simply to allow these regions to have security guarantees and be autonomous. It seems that Russia thought it would accomplish the same in Ukraine by sending a column of tanks to intimidate the government in Kiev and give them time to finish diplomatic negotiations. What Russia didn't anticipate is that NATO had already trained and armed many groups within Ukraine, especially its army, and that they were emboldened and felt strong enough to reject the idea of negotiation. In early stages, in March and April, negotiations were taking place. In fact, if you look at March 2022, between Kuleba and Lavrov, you see that, in fact, 4 out of 5 points were, in fact, discussed. There's no progress on some of these things. However, the idea that Ukraine might become independent, might become neutral again and have security guarantees was, in fact, discussed. And an alternative to NATO was floated by Zelensky himself. Zelensky and his party, the Servant of the People, endorsed an idea where Zelensky wanted to do something called, he wanted to have something called 24, let's say before 2022. In nod to Russia, Ukraine says it's no longer insisting on NATO membership. Basically, Zelensky even proposed something which was a new military alliance, a different one that would guarantee security to Ukraine. It was called U-24. Basically, the idea is, back then, Zelensky was saying that Ukrainian neutrality was on the table. And this was before peace talks were completely scrapped. Now, peace talks were scrapped because of one of two reasons. Either it was because of Boris Johnson's visit to Ukraine and saying that we are not prepared to negotiate with Putin, who is a terrorist, who's literally Hitler. He doesn't say that. Boris Johnson is much more measured. But the idea is that Russia can't be trusted, so don't even negotiate with them. We can win this. But another version is that, in fact, the revelations in Bucha and what was considered beyond the pale and atrocities that Russians have committed in Bucha was basically the reason why the Ukrainian government completely called off the peace talks. Regardless of the reason, Zelensky went from saying every war ends with peace talks and we must, however hard, continue with these peace talks, to basically saying, look, I have no support from the US, I have no support from the UK for peace talks, and moreover, I don't have support from my own people and the right-wing groups that Zelensky had a mandate in order to, he was elected in order to effect peace with Russia in this drawn-out proxy war. But ultimately, if you read the Schneier Post and others, you can read basically how Cohen and others say Zelensky ran as a peace candidate. So that means he won an enormous mandate to make peace, so he has to negotiate with Vladimir Putin. But as a major obstacle, as he says, Ukraine fascists have said, they will kill and remove Zelensky if he continues along this line of negotiating. The fact is that whether they're fascist, nationalist, or just regular people who are fed up with Russia's domination of Ukraine, it's not easy for Zelensky unilaterally to implement any of these things. One of the reasons is because it's in Ukraine's constitution to join NATO. So going back to this idea is that Ukraine has made it even harder to extricate itself from this problem and become neutral, because its president cannot simply unilaterally sign anything like this. It would require the Ukraine's Verkhovna Rada, its parliament, to approve it 2 separate times by a majority or a supermajority, or it could also require the public to do so. There were times, however, that the public demanded a return of the constitution to the 2004 constitution, as we see in the Revolution of Dignity, in the Euromaidan revolution. So the idea that they can just demand, here we go, on February 18th, some 20,000 Euromaidan protesters advanced on the Rada in support of restoring the constitution to 2004 form, which had been repealed by the Constitutional Court of Ukraine shortly after Yanukovych was elected. In other words, Ukraine demonstrators could also try to amend the constitution by force. Although one would ask, what kind of a democracy is this if the people, instead of turning out to vote peacefully, would actually violently intimidate the government into changing its constitution or ousting its president? So these are not the means to to resolve this conflict. Or I should say, if these are the means, they're not the best means. The best means would be to sit down and understand the security concerns of Russia and other countries. So one other thing I would like to say, just to read these quotes: Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite. This is the American ambassador to Moscow writing to the Secretary of State, Condoleezza Rice. How much more clear can it get? 2008. Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines for the Russian elite, not just Putin. In more than 2.5 years of conversations with key Russian players, from knuckle draggers in the dark recesses of the Kremlin to Putin's sharpest liberal critics, I have yet to find anyone who views Ukraine in NATO as anything other than a direct challenge to Russian interests. The question is, and many people ask, did Russia have justification for invading Ukraine? Well, it certainly justifies it in its own national interests. Also, a question was the war provoked? And as we're going to see, the history of the war, it's not clear that there was absolutely zero provocation. What we have to do is compare it to other invasions, occupations, and so forth, and see whether those were started with far lesser reasons. So, for example, the Iraq War was started saying that there were weapons of mass destruction still possessed by Saddam. And instead of waiting for the inspectors to complete their inspections, the U.S. moved in and amassed armies on Iraq's border, went in, removed Saddam. Provocation, justification for the invasion. So compared to that, the entry of a neighboring country into what it considers to be a hostile alliance that it probably would have been rejected from is something that could animate Russia to do so. So again, if you are a president of Russia, whether you are, Putin, or whether you are Medvedev, or indeed even if you are Navalny, you would have to. The first job of the American president is to keep the American people safe. So a lot of presidents would be prepared, and the parliament would be prepared to endorse actions that would secure and put buffers around their country in order to increase its safety. However, it turns out that these very actions often result in blowback, and the opposite is achieved, such as now Finland and Sweden in a bid to join NATO next, with Russia being surrounded by even more countries inside NATO. Leaders like Putin, who felt cornered and ignored, may strike out. He has already threatened military and political consequences if the currently neutral Finland and Sweden attempt to join NATO. Paradoxically, NATO has endangered small countries on the border of Russia, as Georgia learned in 2008 that aspire to join the alliance. So George Kennan, the father of the Cold War containment doctrine, who I just quoted here, was interviewed by Thomas Friedman. These people are sounding the alarm, and were sounding the alarm even back as far as 1998. Has a NATO expansion eastward increased the security of European states, or made them more vulnerable by poking the Russian bear? You could see Nigel Farage in 2014 actively saying this to the EU.
That's a long list of foreign policy failures and contradictions in the last few years, including, of course, the bombing of Libya, the desire to arm the rebels in Syria, has been the unnecessary provocation of Vladimir Putin.
This is 2014, after the Euromaidan revolution.
This EU empire, ever seeking to expand, stated its territorial claim on the Ukraine some years ago. Just to make that worse, of course, some NATO members said they too would like the Ukraine to join NATO. We directly encouraged the uprising in the Ukraine that led to the toppling of the President Yanukovych. And
I will show evidence of this later.
that led, of course, in turn to Vladimir Putin reacting. And the moral of the story is, if you poke the Russian bear with a stick, don't be surprised when he reacts. Now, just to continue with that, today we are rushing through an association agreement at undue speed with the Ukraine, and as we speak, there are NATO soldiers engaged in military exercises in the Ukraine. Have we taken leave of our senses? Do we actually want to have a war with Putin? Because if we do, we're certainly going about it the right way.
Well, those words turned out to be pretty prescient, because we did, in fact, get into an escalating conflict with Putin. And it seems that much of Europe is now about to feel the economic effects of it in terms of energy. But perhaps far more worryingly, this conflict may escalate even further into a direct confrontation between NATO and Russia. It has long been clear that NATO expansion would lead to tragedy. We are now paying the price for U.S. arrogance, an opinion piece in The Guardian. This was February 2022, days after Russia's invasion. We also have essentially this idea from NPR talking about Moscow considers the American bases on NATO's eastern flank to be a provocation, a position that Russia's maintained ever since the alliance began moving into Eastern Europe in the 1990s following the Soviet breakup. After deployment of those missile defense elements, so here's the thing, missile defense elements, the NATO, US's largest military footprint. 2016, what happened was they completed something very interesting. 2 sites in Eastern Europe, near Poland's Baltic coast. Once belonged to the Nazis and then the Soviets, this base. Once the site is finished, the entire $800 million ballistic missile defense shield, do they mean billion? It's interesting. Missile defense shield for NATO countries in Europe, more than a decade in the making, will be complete. In other words, this is called defense, missile defense. And the idea is if Russia lobs anything at Europe, this will try to shoot it down. But of course, anything used for defense could also be turned around and shoot into Russia and be pointed and retrofitted. This is what basically happened later. Top U.S. and NATO officials in 2016 declared the Romanian facility up and running, and a day later broke ground on the Polish site. So once these are completed, which they have been since then, Russia is going to be essentially facing ballistic missile launchers. They say defense shield. Well, perhaps. They say that the state-of-the-art Aegis defense system, which will be ultimately under NATO control, is about protecting the alliance. Of course, everyone says that, against rogue states like Iran, and has nothing to do with Russia. So, in other words, they are telling Russia, don't worry, we're not expanding against you. They've picked a country, and that's Iran, and that's who they are putting up all this machinery to protect against Iran. As we said, but Moscow was worried about this. So, again, it's the motivations, and they're using a lot of these countries where the civilians may not, in fact, want this. So this is what some people, the governments want this, and we often say that they're clamor for U.S. and NATO troops and equipment. Okay, but it's also true that many of these countries' civilian population may be against NATO. So just as an example, I want to show some protests. So here are just recently, this is 3 weeks ago, anti-NATO protest in France. Crazy. Then we've got just recently we had in the Czech Republic. I keep thinking Czechoslovakia, which used to be United States. Czech Republic. We've got thousands rally in Prague against pro-Western government and NATO. Again, there was also a counter protest that was just as large in support of Ukraine and NATO. But just to show you how divided some of these countries are, if you look back at Spain. There was a NATO protest, again, they tried to shut it down. Thousands protest in Madrid against NATO when NATO had a summit. You keep in mind, many of these are lefties. There's a coalition of the far right and the far left, a lot of times against the establishment. Of course, the establishment wants to create this globalist world order, which is, as they say, rules-based and would never attack. The other thing is that NATO, in fact, was not always a defensive alliance. Starting as far back as in the 90s. So 1999, NATO bombed Yugoslavia, claiming, as Putin did to justify his invasion, that there was a genocide taking place of Kosovar Albanians, and that Kosovo was not, in fact, a part of Serbia, an historical birthplace or anything like this, but in fact it was now home to a different population that eventually NATO declared them independent unilaterally. A lot of the elements that you see here, when you see Kosovo independence, basically is similar to how Russia unilaterally recognizes independence of breakaway regions too. But if we look at who did it first or how they did it back then in 1999, NATO in fact went ahead and bombed in a bombing campaign civilian areas in all throughout Yugoslavia, especially the capital. In Serbia they ousted Milosevic, did regime change, and eventually Yugoslavia fell apart, and Kosovo was also declared independent. So initially, Yugoslavia's refusal to sign the Rambouillet Accords was offered as a justification for the use of force. They attempted to gain authorization from the UN Security Council for military action, but were opposed by China and Russia, who indicated they would veto such a measure. As a result, NATO launched its campaign without UN approval, stating it was a humanitarian intervention. Sound familiar? The UN Charter prohibits the use of force, except in cases of a decision by Security Council, under Chapter 7, or self-defense against an armed attack, neither of which were present in this case. By the end of the war, Yugoslav had killed 1,500 combatants while choosing to heavily target Kosovar Albanian civilians. So the war actually, again, increased the civilian toll. Just like with Putin's invasion, perhaps if there was no invasion, the toll would be much minimized. And many were expelled from Kosovo. So during the war, in fact, the very thing that they went to prevent was actually exacerbated. The NATO bombing killed about 1,000 members of the Yugoslav security forces and between 489 and 528 civilians. Luckily, this war was not continued by Russia supplying weapons to Yugoslavia and trying to oppose NATO's war machine. The Yugoslavs surrendered, and as a result, Yugoslavia today enjoys peace, unlike, for example, Libya, which is still a failed state. That's the other thing. NATO intervened in Libya. Now, this war was authorized by the UN, and NATO was carrying out Security Council mandate. However, afterwards, they completely abandoned Libya, and millions of people in Libya have lived in a failed state for a very long time. Gangs, they've got terrorists setting up home base here. Of course, to us, the only thing that mattered in the U.S. was the 4 Americans killed in Benghazi. Much more ink has been spilled about that, and much more airtime devoted to that than all the millions of people in Libya. Similarly with Saudi Arabia, and Khashoggi got way more attention than all the people in Yemen that were being bombed. So the idea of NATO being a defensive alliance that is only there to protect was kind of shattered in 1999. And then you see, even if they do have justification to invade, they can leave a country completely devastated. Now, the other problem is we don't know what was said behind closed doors. So we have NATO expansion. What Gorbachev heard. This is from the National Security Archive. And in fact, it turns out recently that declassified documents show security assurances against NATO expansion to Soviet leaders from Baker, Bush, Genscher, Kohl, Gates, Mitterrand, Thatcher, Hurd, Major, and Werner. In other words, there is written evidence that security assurances were given. This is not just hearsay. Gorbachev maybe doesn't remember, but other people were giving these assurances. Of course, all those assurances were violated. If you have a treaty, then perhaps it's much more public and ratified. It's harder to violate that. But even those things were violated routinely as far as back as the Native Americans said, white man speaks with forked tongue. One administration, for example, the Trail of Tears, one administration, Thomas Jefferson, said that Native Americans could be integrated into society if they simply gave up their cultures, religions, and lifestyles in favor of this kind of sedentary agricultural lifestyle. However, he said once they did that, they would be accepted. Then the next administration of Andrew Jackson basically said, no, even that is not good enough. And the Trail of Tears is, for example, what is used to refer to 50 years of ethnic cleansing and forced expulsions of Native Americans, forced displacements of about 60,000 American Indians, 5 civilized tribes. Civilized because, again, they took on essentially the customs of the occupiers. That wasn't enough anyway. So, treaties with the United States, whether it's that or whether it's, for example, the agreed framework that Bill Clinton had negotiated with Kim Jong-il of North Korea. That framework, the objective was freezing and replacement of North Korea's nuclear power plant program, essentially to phase out so they would not get a nuclear bomb. And in return, there would be step-by-step normalization of the relations between the countries, U.S. and North Korea. Implementation of the agreement was troubled from the start, but its key elements were being implemented until it effectively broke down in 2003 under the George Bush administration and the Republicans. And we've seen this also with the Iran deal. There was an open letter penned by essentially a bunch of people, but especially the U.S. Congress, the Republicans in U.S. Congress. They basically, U.S. Congress open letter to Iran around 20, I don't know what year it was. But basically they said, Tom Cotton and Republicans basically said to Iran, don't trust our administration's deal because the very next administration is going to just rip it up. So even if, these assurances were given, there's no guarantee that they would not be changed later necessarily. This is all to say that it's not just Russia that cannot be trusted, but also if administrations in a country constantly change, it's not necessarily the case that the next administration would honor the previous administration's thing. And of course, this is true all across the board. It was true when Hamas was elected in Gaza. Basically, this was before 2005. It just reneged on all the agreements that its predecessors had done. As a result, they were sanctioned and so on. I don't want to get into that right now, but my point simply is that even if we got to the bottom of who said what to whom, and even if we had a treaty, that is still not necessarily good enough assurances. There was a Budapest memorandum, for example, between the United States, Russia, and Ukraine, that if Ukraine would just give up its nuclear weapons, then what would happen would be that here's Boris Yeltsin, here's Clinton, and here's Ukraine's president. I apologize, his name eludes me right now. At the time, they basically assured Ukraine that its territorial that they would cooperate to ensure its territorial integrity. But as we see here, NATO's expansion and refusal to engage with Russia in talks about the very thing, Ukraine's security, endangered its very security. So that's the ironic part, is as we saw here, and we said that whether the advancement of NATO eastward has increased the security or made them more vulnerable. Well, if you're refusing to talk to the very country whose security you seem to be threatening with your expansion, then it's not clear whether you're actually helping Ukraine's country, the country of Ukraine, and its citizens. And so the Budapest Memorandum, the spirit of actually implementing it would involve NATO listening to Russia's demand to respect its red line and not welcome Ukraine into NATO. This is what Tulsi Gabbard said to Tucker Carlson on his show. This is what she said back in the beginning when the invasion first started 8 months ago. This is what she said.
And that is the thing that is most tragic about this heartbreaking situation with this war, is that it could have been avoided if President Biden and NATO had done exactly what you were just talking about. in agreeing, hey, we're going to take NATO off the table for Ukraine, something that both the U.S. and NATO have agreed is not likely to ever happen, and something that is a legitimate security concern for Russia, that they won't accept having U.S. and NATO troops on their border within Ukraine. Had the U.S. and NATO leadership done this, this situation could have been prevented. I think that the problem here in America is that people who bring this up, people who ask these questions, people who challenge the decisions that the Biden administration has been making in this are smeared and caricaturized as traitors, rather than actually pointing at the truth, which is this administration is not acting in the best interest of the American people. They are turning their backs on the American people.
And with these new elections in November, a lot of Americans are starting to wonder, why are we sending all these billions to Ukraine? Are we really helping the Ukrainian people? There's more, as we've seen, more war and destruction, as I've shown later in other videos. Afghanistan was used in the same way. Syria was used in the same way in the proxy war. What Tulsi talks about is Jeffrey Sachs, one of the people that has been speaking out for years about Kennedy and his how he was able to create peace with the Soviets. Jeffrey Sachs is often derided, but then he talks about how he was in there. He was talking to the people, in fact, who were the decision makers. He was talking to Yeltsin. He said, we could implement in Russia the same things that worked elsewhere. And he got blank stares from the U.S. and refusals to normalize relations, improve relations. So this was a systematic thing. If you look at anything Jeffrey Sachs says, here's, for example, just one. He's been in there for years. This is a left-wing show, for example. We just saw a right-wing show with Tucker Carlson, Fox News. Now we're going to see a left-wing interview with Sachs.
The Biden administration is preparing to ask Congress to approve a new $1.1 billion arms sale to Taiwan. The package reportedly includes 60
I'm going to make a separate video about Taiwan, but here we go. Here's Sachs talking about 20 years of U.S. refusal to normalize anything, because the policy was always to surround Russia, contain Russia, and not really treat them as a diplomatic partner, but really just someone who eventually would be surrounded like a caged animal, and the Russian bear would be contained.
Why don't you take it from Jeffrey Sachs writes. Jeffrey Sachs, welcome to Democracy Now! Why don't you take it from there?
Good to be with you.
What is the story that people in the West and around the world should understand about what's happening right now with these conflicts, with Russia and Ukraine, and with China?
The main point, Amy, is that we are not using diplomacy. We are using weaponry. This sale now announced to Taiwan that you've been discussing this morning is just another case in point. This does not make Taiwan safer. This does not make the world safer. It certainly doesn't make the United States safer. This goes back a long way. I think it's useful to start 30 years ago. The Soviet Union ended, and some American leaders got it into their head that there was now what they called the unipolar world, that the U.S. was the sole superpower and we could run the show. The results have been disastrous. We have had now 3 decades of militarization of American foreign policy. A new database that Tufts is maintaining has just shown that there have been more than 100 military interventions by the United States since 1991.
Let that sink in. Let that sink in. 100 just in the last 30 years. And we don't even know about most of them as the public.
It's really unbelievable. And I have seen in my own experience over the last 30 years, working extensively in Russia, in Central Europe, in China, and in other parts of the world, how the U.S. approach is a military first and often a military only approach. We arm who we want. We call for NATO enlargement no matter what other countries say may be harmful to their security interests. We brush aside anyone else's security interests. And when they complain, we ship more armaments to our allies in that region. We go to war when we want, where we want, whether it was Afghanistan or Iraq or the covert war against Assad in Syria, which is even today not properly understood by the American people, or the war in Libya. And we say, we're peace loving. What's wrong with Russia and China? They are so warlike. They're out to undermine the world. And we end up in terrible confrontations. The war in Ukraine, just to finish the introductory view, could have been avoided and should have been avoided through diplomacy. What President Putin of Russia was saying for years was do not expand NATO into the Black Sea, not to Ukraine, much less to Georgia, which if people look on the map, straight across to the eastern edge of the Black Sea. Russia said this will surround us. This will jeopardize our security.
You can go and read and watch this for yourself. In response, many people unironically say that Putin is Hitler and we must, or similar to Hitler, and we must contain Russia. because if we don't, then Russia will in fact go ahead and annex all of Europe or invade Europe and so on. The thing is that from all sides, people see similar things. They say we are acting defensive, and these other people are attacking us. Russia says this, and US and the NATO allies say this. But in fact, when you grow big enough, China says this, others say this, as you grow big enough, what you start to realize is that you're coming up against these other groups. And if you don't negotiate and you don't peacefully resolve these things in a framework that doesn't involve violence, you're going to cause a lot of damage to these smaller countries. Like in my video, I talk about Afghanistan. So, it's not just me saying it. Thomas Friedman, on the eve of the war, the invasion, again, this is New York Times, openly said, this is Putin's war, but America and NATO aren't innocent bystanders, right? When a major conflict like Ukraine breaks out, journalists always ask themselves, where should I station myself? Kiev, Moscow? In this case, my answer is none of these. The only place for understanding this war is inside Putin's head. This is what the idea that people have is it's all Putin. I've done a video where I've shown that it's the Russian public supporting this war. The Russian public supports the war in Ukraine, just like the American public supported the war in Iraq. And they've done it for at least a year or two before support started dropping below 50%. So we can understand, and then we reelected the very president who perpetrated, let's say that war, that invasion, and ultimately the more damaging occupation, prolonged occupation of Iraq. So it's opinion polls show the majority of Russians support the actions of the Russian armed force. In fact, the main criticism that Putin gets is from the war hawks in his country, who complain that he hasn't done more, and he hasn't done shock and awe kind of things that the U.S. has done. As you can see, this is the invasion of Iraq, for example, what shock and awe looks like. This is shock and awe designed to demoralize the enemy. Imagine this going on in the capital city for a few days. Okay? This is the kind of stuff that was not happening in Kiev. Russia was not doing these kinds of things, and the war hawks within Russia were almost upset that Russia didn't just overrun the country quickly, but instead had this comical, column of tanks going up for weeks, giving them a chance to sort of, do diplomacy or reach a peace agreement, which of course they did not. We look at my video about the other causes of the Ukraine war within Ukraine, the Minsk agreements, the Normandy format. That's something that is very, very relevant, because there were attempts since 2014 to defuse and de-escalate the situation. Back then it was, in fact, Petro Poroshenko, the president of Ukraine. Putin, of course, had been president the entire time since 2014 that this conflict was taking place. Germany and France, over here, Germany and France, were very interested to bring about an end to the war. Just like French President Hollande and also Sarkozy back in 2008, Sarkozy was successful in bringing a quick end to the Georgian-Russia war. But here, we had basically a failure over and over. And also the president of Belarus and Minsk, the capital of Belarus, was used to sign the Minsk agreements, where the Minsk agreement was essentially something very, very straightforward, or something that pretty much was all positive: immediate and full cessation of hostilities, ceasefire, pull out of all heavy weapons by both sides, equal distance, demilitarized zone, effective monitoring, verification of ceasefire regime. Ukraine would eventually control all its borders again, and basically all that would happen is, there would be a dialogue on local elections and independence, not even independence, autonomy of these regions. But the idea is that the constitutional reform, the key element of which is decentralization, taking into account the peculiarities. Interesting about decentralization, that Zelensky's government initially claimed that it liked decentralization and was libertarian. In fact, Zelensky's government, as we said already, the mandate was in order to be a peace candidate, in order to have a dialogue with Russia. All of that failed, and I have a separate video about that, which is basically the, shall we say, the internal causes of the war, which were Russia's population, ethnic Russians in the Donbass region, constantly being part of a proxy war, which Russia itself had perpetuated. But here I focus on the NATO reasons for the war. And let's just wrap up with sort of this idea of what is a just cause for an invasion, or there is normally no just cause. It's the failure of politicians to reach any sort of agreement or to uphold an agreement. So there's multiple failures that have to happen. But of course, we don't hold these people to account. They don't go to the war. Their families don't go to the war. In fact, they get more support and profit from each other often, and keep each other in power during the war. So, the approval ratings go up, and the incentives are completely wrong. But anyway, what are the stated reasons for Russia to engage? One of the big ones that I've explored in this video was the expansion of NATO. And the brightest red lines were Ukraine, as we've said. This was stated unequivocally by the very people who were the ambassadors. Ukrainian entry into NATO is the brightest of all red lines, not just for the Russian elite, but for pretty much everyone, key Russian players, even the sharpest liberal critics, probably including Navalny, if he was around then. No one views Ukraine and NATO as anything other than a direct challenge. So the question is that enough in order to invade a neighbor? So the answer is, what would other countries do? Well, countries have invaded their neighbors for far less. And the United States has already won against all of its neighbors, except maybe Canada, which tried to invade and failed. But it has taken land from Mexico. It has taken large swaths of land in the Mexican-American War. And you could see just how much land was in fact taken in here. This entire area was Mexico, but of course now it belongs to the United States. You got here California, you got here Texas. All of these have Spanish names from El Paso all the way up to San Francisco and San Fernando. So basically, the United States has already conquered pretty much everybody. We're not even talking about the Native Americans here, who both the English imperialist and the Spanish imperialist brutally repressed and ethnically cleansed from the continent. So they came upon each other. The United States took this territory. The United States has pretty much eliminated all threats to itself here. The one threat it had was Cuba. Cuba, they had the Bay of Pigs invasion in 1961, where they went ahead and basically sponsored some people to invade Cuba. The invasion failed. But what happened was, under JFK, is that after the invasion failed, the next year, Cuba asked the USSR, they started asking USSR for protection. Sound familiar? I thought every country is allowed to work out its own security arrangements. Well, Kennedy reacted, as we saw, in the Cuban Missile Crisis. Kennedy blockaded Cuba. And so what happened was there's an air naval blockade. There's a lot of blockading of Cuba. And what would happen, and Kennedy almost like escalated the situation. What if Russians had said, nope, the USSR would say, every country has the right to be there, and they would continue to give weapons to Russia, in this case, to Cuba. Well, we don't know what would happen, but it could have escalated into nuclear war. One wrong move could have happened. Now, we have a similar situation on Russia's border, where Zelensky himself now is saying that Ukraine is a de facto NATO member. Well, after Russians decimated the initial Ukrainian army, Ukraine got fresh weapons, fresh training from NATO, billions of dollars in weapons. Now they're getting intelligence from NATO. They, in fact, have the Foreign Legion, the International Legion on the ground, including some people say ISIS members who joined up to be paid to fight there. Regardless, however, Russia has the Wagner group as well that they pay to recruit people from prison. Look, this is all very despicable on both sides in terms of who is being fighting, and then regular people are conscripted to fight each other. Men are not allowed to leave the country. I mean, this is states coercing citizens to fight a war that many of them are completely disillusioned by and don't want to do. And it's these politicians that make them do it. But my point here is the big geopolitics. Ukraine is already a de facto NATO member. So what is Russia supposed to do? Are they supposed to just pack up and go home, leaving a country like this on their border? Of course, the country doesn't like them. Just like Cuba didn't like the U.S. invasion, would the U.S. simply allow Cuba to station missiles there? So the Russian rhetoric to their people and their consumption, if you look at Putin's own address recently, Putin talks about Ukraine as a forepost of NATO. And so he's talking about, this is starting from February 15th, he was saying this before he invaded. But then, he's saying it now. They've been very consistent in saying they cannot suffer a country that is hostile to them on their own border, that is part of a military alliance that arms and trains them. If you go ahead and here you go. We perceive the forceful containment of Russia as a direct threat to national security, which is exactly what we intended to remove. With the legal agreements based on the drafts we submitted, for a few months, Russia had tried to fast track diplomacy to avert their invasion. We forget this, but basically NATO said, no, we are not having these talks at all. Russia was completely snubbed by NATO, and Stoltenberg, I would say, is one of the most intransigent leaders of NATO. And more than that, Russia tried to work bilaterally with other countries like France. They had talks with Macron and others. Frankly, Russia gave up at some point because they were like, we're just not going to be treated as a partner in negotiations at all. And they've been saying this openly. Now, Russia sucks at PR. They just suck with their denazification bullshit and this other stuff that they say. They're conflating everything. But again, within their country, their messaging has been clear. And with their speeches, their messaging has been pretty much consistent. But in terms of PR, yes, they suck. Let's listen to the rest of what Putin openly said before the invasion.
На основе внесенных нами проектов. Повторю, полученные нами от Соединенных Штатов и других.
He says, I repeat it, the response we got from NATO to proposals on our security guarantees, in our opinion,
членов НАТО ответы на предложения по гарантиям безопасности, на наш взгляд, не отвечают.
do not meet the 3 basic Russian requirements mentioned above. What were those requirements? Russia wants basically to be assured security.
Повторю, полученные нами от Соединенных Штатов и других и членов НАТО ответы на предложения по гарантиям безопасности, на наш взгляд, не отвечают упомянутым 3 базовым российским требованиям. Что касается того, как Россия будет действовать дальше.
How will Russia act further?
По плану.
According to the plan. He's saying, he is basically saying, look, we're open with what we're going to do. And again, this was telegraphed, before. I think that countries should engage other countries with the understanding that you can have diplomacy with them. Russia has been telegraphing as hard as it can with its shitty PR capabilities. But in all official communications and publications and NATO, in public speeches, they've been consistent in saying, look, we want dialogue, we want assurances. And, frankly, the Budapest Memorandum was supposed to if you don't want to do it for Russia, do it for Ukraine, right? Is go to the table instead of using that military first strategy that Jeffrey Sachs was talking about.
А из чего он будет складываться? Из реальной обстановки на местах.
The plan will depend on what the real situation on the ground is.
Кто может ответить на то, как она будет складываться, реальная обстановка? Пока никто.
So he says the situation on the ground, nobody knows exactly what will unfold. What unfolded later in February, a few days after this, is an uptick in hostilities in the Donbass region, perhaps in response to their petition and recognition by Russia of their independence. If you see uptick in violence on Donbass, and you look at 2022 like this, you're going to see essentially they allege that ceasefire violations started, and of course Russia started to evacuate people from Donbass into Russia in preparation to come to roll in. Anyway, let's finish.
Это зависит не только от нас.
It doesn't depend only on
Мы
us.
намерены и будем стремиться к тому, чтобы договариваться с нашими партнерами.
But he's saying we will continue to try to engage in diplomatic talks with our partners. Over here we have Germany's Schultz.
По тем вопросам, которые были нами поставлены, для их решения дипломатическим путем.
So again, Russia has been calling for diplomatic solutions of NATO's expansion and other things. Let's finish up.
Только добавить, что по нашим оценкам, то, что происходит на Донбассе сегодня, это и есть геноцид.
He is openly saying that according to his assessment, what's happening in Donbass constitutes genocide. This is an often used concept to justify invasion. Of course, there was a talk of genocide in Libya before, Gaddafi shooting at his own people, right, before we invaded. The word genocide today is definitely nothing compared to genocides of yesteryear. We're talking about the Armenian genocide, the Holocaust. We're talking about genocides in South Asia, for example, of many of these people, Rohingya, the Tamil people, and so on. So when we talk about genocide today, it's just lost a lot of the, it's been cheapened a little bit. So I agree that what's happening in Donbass was not a genocide, but in fact a proxy war. But this proxy war has, instead of far from being diplomatically settled, it basically increased, as I've shown here. So the last thing I want to talk about is what were the justifications within Russia and what were the reasons for invading Ukraine. One was to stop it from, as a last-ditch effort, to head off the ability for Ukraine to join NATO. And this was, in fact, predicted by Arestovich in 2019. It was predicted completely when he was saying that, we have a huge land border with Russia, right? And he basically talks about how a war with Russia is actually preferable to a big war with Russia is actually preferable to being absorbed into Russia and its economy. To him, it's better to just have all these civilians die, not himself, of course, or his family, but these fighters die, these conscripted men. But in the end, Ukraine emerges as a NATO member. So thinking of war hawks like Arestovich went something like this.
И там развал ЕС и НАТО и вообще политика быть изгоем.
Let me find exactly. One way or another, we will drift into one or another supranational military alliance. There will either be this Taiga Union, Russia, or NATO. We were in this Taiga thing, and I personally don't want to. We haven't been in NATO, so let's try. So basically, we'll definitely, he says, not maintain neutrality. this means that the main task is to join NATO, and no social or economic sacrifices are, too big in the face of this task. Even if, he's basically saying everything looks not so bad, but the price of joining NATO is likely to be a larger war with Russia, or a sequence of such conflicts. He goes on. I want to just have this really quick prediction of Arestovich. Here we go. This is going to be. Watch the subtitles.
Тогда мы можем говорить о каких-то сроках прекращения войны. Нет, ни о каких сроках прекращения войны мы не будем говорить. Наоборот, это, скорее всего, подтолкнет крупные военные операции России против Украины. Потому что они должны нас будут просадить в инфраструктурном отношении и превратить здесь все в разваленную территорию для того, чтобы нас неохотно. То есть Россия сможет пойти на прямую конфронтацию с НАТО? Конечно, Россия, не НАТО. Мы не успеем. Они должны это сделать до того, как мы вступим в НАТО, чтобы мы не были интересны НАТО.
You see, so he's basically saying that Russia will have to invade Ukraine because of Ukraine's interest in joining NATO. After all, it is in their constitution, and NATO has been calling to them and arming them since 2014. In 2019, Arestovich nails pretty much all of the ways that Russia will attack. And so this wasn't completely unprovoked, let's say. This was known in advance.
Перестали быть интересны, как разваленная территория. С вероятностью 99,9%.
With a 99% probability, according to Arestovich.
Наша цена за вступление в НАТО – это большая война с Россией. А если мы не вступим в НАТО, это поглощение России в течение 10-12 лет.
So he's basically saying that if we don't join NATO, then we're going to be part of some other military alliance with Russia, perhaps, or some economic alliance. Personally, I don't know if that's so bad. I don't know why, for people like Arestovich, it's much more preferable to just completely disentangle themselves from Russia. But as you see in the UK, in the other videos done by the BBC that I've shown, there's a lot of people in Western Ukraine who think this way, who would like to leave the sphere of influence of Russia as much as they can. Of course, all the while speaking Russian. And now Arestovich has sort of turned around and started blaming Ukrainians for going too far in this, snubbing the Russian language, snubbing ethnic Russians completely. He said, we still need to have ties with Russia. Well, that's what happens. It's like Nigel Farage, who got upset that his party was overrun by racists, he said, UKIP, and he left UKIP. I mean, well, you've kind of encouraged the Britain First mentality that would attract the racists. Here, you've encouraged the type of people that have longed to break free completely of the Russian language and influence. So, what he started will actually eclipse by far what he even had wanted himself.
Вот и вся вилка, в которой мы находимся. А теперь давайте выбирать Зеленского. Подождите, теперь если поставить чашу на весы, а что лучше в таком случае? Конечно, крупная война с...
What's better, being absorbed by Russia into some kind of alliance, economic, military, or a big war with Russia? Arestovich is clear. A big war with Russia is better. He doesn't explain why it's better, but he definitely feels this way.
С Россией переход в НАТО по результатам победы над Россией. Что такое может быть крупная война с Россией? Это воздушная операция наступательная, вторжение российских армий, вот 4, которые они создали на наших границах, там осада Киева, попытка окружить войска, которые в АТО находятся, ВОС, операция Объединенных сил, прорыв через Крымский перешейк, выход на Новокаховское водохранилище, чтобы воду в Крым дать, наступление с территории Беларуси, там создание новых народных республик, диверсии, удары по объектам критической инфраструктуры и так далее, воздушно-десантные. Вот что такое полноценная война.
And he totally nailed it and then said...
Вероятность ее 99%. Когда? После 21-22 самые критические, 20-22 самые критические.
So the guy was a genius predicting this, but was the information there? As I've shown, the information was there if people kept on the course which they kept, which is to say Ukrainian politicians, while having a mandate to work with Russia and resolve the conflict, instead decided to work with the US and the UK and exacerbate the conflict, essentially sacrificing civilian lives, conscripting men to fight, so that in the end, they can finally be part of NATO. Does this make them safer? We just don't know. But we certainly understand why this is one of the brightest of all red lines to the Russian elite. So the question is, did Russia have a reason to invade Ukraine? Well, other countries have been bombed and invaded for far less. When the Pope, Tulsi Gabbard, Tucker Carlson, some of the top people with the top slots in TV or radio, like Joe Rogan, say this, they're called Russian assets. But as we've seen, people in Spain protest, people in France protest. Are they Putin apologists and Russian assets too? The Pope comes out and suggests that the barking of NATO at Russia's door may have forced Putin to invade Ukraine. And again, this is something the Pope saying, people say he's veering into conspiracies. So there's often this thing where you're a vaccine denialist, you're anti-vaxxer, or you are a white supremacist, or you're, basically a communist, or some word that's used by a group to completely shut down the conversation and take you out of legitimate discourse. It doesn't matter if you're Jeffrey Sachs and you've actually been in the trenches for so long. It doesn't matter if you're Nigel Farage, who's been talking to the the EU government. It doesn't matter who you are, Tulsi Gabbard or the Pope. you will get attacked by this group who wants the agenda to be exactly what Kennedy warned against, which is to essentially create a binary situation. Either a nuclear-powered adversary retreats in humiliating defeat, or there's some kind of nuclear war. Perhaps Kennedy forgot maybe a third way, and we have yet to discuss that third way. But as we saw, Kennedy was very, very worried about exactly this. Just to replay it again.
For diversity. For in the final analysis, our most basic common link is that we all inhabit this small planet. We all breathe the same air. We all cherish our children's futures. We all persevere in the search for peace, in the hope that constructive changes within the communist bloc might bring within reach solutions which now seem beyond us.
This is the key. This is the warning that we're currently hurtling towards the cliff with, that Kennedy said was a collective death wish for the world.
We must conduct our affairs in such a way that it becomes in the communist interest to agree on a genuine peace. And above all, while defending our own vital interests, nuclear powers must avert those confrontations which bring an adversary to a choice of either a humiliating retreat or a nuclear war.
He says the consequences of doing so would be pretty grave.
To adopt that kind of course in the nuclear age would be evidence only of the bankruptcy of our policy or of a collective death wish for the world.
Perhaps it's the bankruptcy of today's policies, to be unwilling to deal with other countries and to see their points of view, regardless of any protests by citizens, regardless of the discussion on the ground. So you could listen to military analysts or people talking about how NATO is de facto arming Ukraine. They were behind the surprise offensive. They're giving the weapons and the training to thousands of people now. They're also giving the intelligence, where to bomb, how to sink ships, and so on. And again, you could argue that NATO isn't in fact treating Ukraine as a member, but rather as the next Afghanistan. There are these opinions. And so, they've rejected Ukraine right now. And Stoltenberg has said the key thing right now is keep arming Ukraine. You guys fight. You guys fight over there, so we don't have to fight them over here. A very interesting way to treat people. So what I would like to say is, if a quote special military operation, first of all, in order to declare a war, you need to have a war. You need to say that you're going to be bombing the other country. As sad as it is, the way that it looks when you're actually bombing the other country, destroying their infrastructure, is what I've already shown. It looks pretty much like this. This is the capital city, right? Or the devastation of it ends up looking like this. Grozny in Chechnya, for example, was one of the most bombed out cities on earth at the time, but it has since been superseded by Homs and Aleppo, where you could see the drone footage from Homs showing utter devastation, something like this. All right, looks like there's too many ads on this thing. I can't show it to you. But the idea is that these cities that were devastated far beyond even Mariupol, I will show it to you just on a different thing. Here, drone footage of homes in Syria shows utter devastation. These images are very, very sad. The entire city basically looks like this. And in Aleppo, it's similar. You can go and look at these yourself. Far, far beyond the type of thing. So this is what war can bring. A special military operation, on the other hand, is something that countries claim, has limited aims and doesn't necessarily attack so many civilians. Like in this war, we find it's one of the only wars where less civilians die than combatants, professional, warriors, and that goes to show that both armies are trying to spare the civilians. If you look, for example, at Afghanistan and civilian casualties, you will find that in fact, look, this is the U.S. one, but if you look at the Soviet one, you had 2 million Afghan civilians killed, 15,000 Soviet soldiers, and then you've had a lot less people killed in terms of the army because people had flak jackets, they had ways to defend themselves. So it's unique in Ukraine that both armies are sort of trying to fight finally away from the cities, and that definitely helps. Anyway, so if you're not going to declare war and you're going to have a special military operation, what would be enough justification? Well, if you look at the U.S. history, what was the justification for its bombings of countries? Look, for example, at Laos. In Laos, there was a civil war. Essentially, the U.S. got involved And what happened was the U.S. got involved and essentially became started bombing Laos. And the thing about that is Laos was bombed more than any country has been bombed in history. And yet none of this was really told to the American public. In fact, this, if anything, was considered a special military operation. It would be this. And the weirdest thing about it is that essentially U.S. bombing of Laos, if you look at Operation Barrel Roll, and you look at what were the reasons for it, we read, Operation Barrel Roll is a covert U.S. Air Force 2nd Division interdiction and close air support campaign conducted in the Kingdom of Laos. This is in between the 60s, and it went on for years and years and years. The operation resulted in 260 million bombs being dropped on Laos, making Laos the most heavily bombed nation in history. This is what's crazy, is that the original purpose of the operation was to serve as a signal to the Democratic Republic of Vietnam, which is North Vietnam, to cease its support for the insurgency then taking place in Republic of Vietnam, South Vietnam. In other words, we bombed the country more than any country in history just to send a signal to a different country. So when it comes to reasons for attacking, it doesn't get much less than this. Laos had absolutely no way to attack the United States, presented no threat to either the U.S. or its allies. And it was essentially us going 3,000 miles around the world in order to send a message to a neighboring country that they would not allow communism to spread. Now compare that to, say, Putin saying that he would not want the Nazi ideology to spread within Ukraine. The difference is that here, the United States went 3,000 miles away in order to fight this war. And those people presented absolutely no threat. They weren't on the border with the U.S. They were not going to have a base where a hostile country, maybe Russia or China, would station their weapons. Literally, that country was totally out of the way, and that country did not have Americans that they needed to protect. Whereas here, a lot of ethnic Russians, perhaps millions, were facing these conditions. So the combination of having a country on your border that wants to join a military alliance that historically has expanded against you and host weapons there, plus the fact that this very country now is shelling your ethnic citizens, not citizens, but the people, the citizens of that country. So yeah, international law says, okay, it's happening within Ukraine's borders, and so therefore it's completely an internal matter. But honestly, when it's your citizens being attacked this way, that's another reason why Russia might want to intervene. And again, comparing to reasons for invading other countries that the United States has, the United States has invaded for far lesser reasons. So there's this idea of whataboutism. The idea of whataboutism is, well, Russia, the United States has done a bad thing over and over and over, and it continues to do bad things. But hey, that's totally off topic because we're here to talk about only Russia. Well, the thing is that whataboutism may, in fact, yes, the community, you're trying to say it's a red herring, but the thing is that whataboutism can also be used the other way. The goal is to question, basically, whataboutism can be used the other way. Accusing an interlocutor of whataboutism can also itself be manipulative and serve the motive of discrediting, as critical talking points can be used selectively and purposefully, even as the starting point of the conversation. Meaning, you set the agenda right away. Let's talk about only Israel. Let's talk about only Russia. Anything else is whataboutism. And let's hold it to a standard that absolutely no other country has met and expected to behave differently. Framing effect, priming, cherry picking. So deviation from the script, talking about, well, no country is perfect, and we should really deal with countries like countries, and we should deal with people as humans. Compare apples to apples is often met with, well, that's whataboutism. And the thing is, that's not a constructive way to solve problems because it excuses double standards. It basically, it basically exposes the hypocrisy, excuses hypocrisy to say, okay, this country is supposed to behave perfectly, but our country would definitely not do that in their situation. But that's whataboutism. So what if our country wouldn't do that in their situation? They should do that in their situation. Well, that's unreasonable. And you can see that the United States in the Cuban Missile Crisis acted, like I said, it blockaded Cuba. And if the situation wasn't resolved, what would happen from that blockade? Well, we see the blockade of Yemen, where the Saudi coalition actually blockaded the entire country. It has led to some of the worst humanitarian crisis ever, not ever, but in modern times. So when we have Yemen this year facing outright catastrophe, according to the UN, rising hunger, food insecurity, millions of people, okay? We're not talking about just like refugees from Ukraine going to Germany and Ukraine being able to import food every day from Poland and even have weapons smuggled in. No, we're talking about complete blockade of the country for years. So this is what's happening. So if Russia was to blockade Ukraine the way that the United States blockaded Cuba, or the way that the Saudis blockaded Yemen, it would cause a much bigger humanitarian catastrophe that is currently the case. Russians have not blockaded Ukraine. They have not cut off Ukraine from shipments. If anything, they agreed to have shipments out of Ukraine because Ukraine has tons of food, which is great. It wouldn't have the humanitarian crisis that happens in the desert, like where Yemen is located. So Ukrainians wouldn't be hurting for food if Russia did in fact blockade Ukraine. However, Ukraine might be hurting for other materials. None of this has happened in Ukraine, which is why when the Washington Post talks about the latest findings about who was responsible for the airstrikes and who actually helped the Saudis, they found that in fact the U.S. Led a lot of these things. And what you see in this article is that the Yemen crisis right now is worse. As bad as the Ukraine war is, it is not the worst conflict even right now. And the humanitarian crisis isn't the worst right now. People in the capital city of Ukraine, in Kiev, and other cities go about their business. Yes, their life right now has become worse because Russia is starting to bomb their infrastructure. But this very thing has happened for years in Yemen, and for every hospital bombed in Ukraine, there's like 100 hospitals or 10 hospitals bombings that occurred in Yemen. So let's read. Saudi-led airstrikes in Yemen have been called war crimes. Many relied on U.S. support. That's a tame headline. Look at the subheadline. A joint Washington Post analysis reveals for the first time this year, 2022, that the United States supported the majority of Air Force squadrons involved in the Saudi coalition's air campaign. So it's not just that many, but the majority of the squadrons involved. Of course, the weapons came from the U.S. And Trump talked about this openly, about jobs. You know, they basically talk about Trump jobs Saudi Arabia. And what he said is he kept inflating the number. The Trump administration kills coldly in Yemen, putting jobs before lives. In other words, he's touting how many jobs are created in the weapons industry. And you know, Trump just says the quiet part out loud. Other presidents simply did it without saying this kind of thing. And again, we don't necessarily use the same words about the Saudis or Mohammed bin Salman as we do about Putin. We don't say he's an unelected dictator. We don't say that he represses the rights of minorities or women in his country. We don't say that he has been engaging in a brutal bombing of and blockade of Yemen, creating a humanitarian catastrophe that's larger than any other conflict right now in the world. No, since Saudis are our allies, we don't use that language at all. But if we did, the same kind of shrill hysteria would then emerge and say, if we don't stop Saudi Arabia here, they're going to keep expanding. We use that language against our enemies like Iran, but we don't use that language against our allies. So to sum up, humanitarian catastrophes of huge proportions happen when you blockade a country. Russia hasn't done that in Ukraine. Plus, Ukraine has a lot of food. But Russia has started to take out the electrical infrastructure in Ukraine, which will harm a lot of people in the winter. And this war has effects far beyond Ukraine. The grain export, if it hadn't happened, millions of people would be facing rising hunger and possible starvation because of this. So again, people are against this all across the country, and again, all across the world. There's many people against it, and it's not honest to say that all these people are simply motivated by some weird desire to allow Russia to take over everything, and they just love Putin. No, these people are simply saying that the pot is calling the kettle black, and they want the pot and the kettle to get together and actually work things out. So, can we have a peace agreement? Can we bring people to the table? That depends on what the leaders in the US, Russia, China, and the large countries do. And that depends on the public. Thank you for watching. Okay. We are going to have Noam Chomsky on the program for the first half. Let me see. I'll be right back with better lighting. Right. Ooh, I actually like that. It just appeared out of nowhere on this thing. Popped in right there. Boom. So this time around, I think a little change of clothes would be good. Kind of like the wartime Zelensky clothing change. All right. Let me see where Noam Chomsky is. I've enabled live transcription. I'm going to be sharing my screen as usual. Oh, there we are.
Starting?
Yeah, how are you?
Okay. You got, can you hear me?
I can hear you just fine. Can you hear me?
As well as I can hear, but I can see the transcript.
Well, that's good. It seems that you've added to your beard, and I took away from mine. So it's like I have donated to you.
You leave it alone, it keeps growing till Valeria gets tired of it and cuts it.
Yep, I have something like that myself. So, this is, as you know, this is a program where I talk about politics, and we've spoken before. I'm going to share my screen. There is so much that I want to discuss. I've seen a lot of what you've said recently on Amy Goodman's show and so on. So I won't spend time rehashing it, but I think there are some very, very important developments that we need to discuss. So let me know if you can see my screen.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So the way that I normally do this, just to remind everyone who's going to be watching this, is, we go back and forth and I kind of present what's going on, and I would love to get your opinion and your perspective.
Unfortunately,
yeah.
Sorry, I can't see the transcript while the screen is there.
Oh, one moment. Are you able to hear me when I talk?
A little, enough barely to make out what you're saying, but okay, let's try.
Let's try. If you're having any difficulty, I'll try to bring back the transcript and just remove the screen share. Okay. All right. So in the first half of this program, we have Noam Chomsky joining us. I wanted to speak about the current events and the nuclear clock and the nuclear escalation that seems to be becoming more and more serious. I also want to go through the history of the Russia-Ukraine conflict and kind of show videos which were from 2014 and 2015 from mainstream sources like the BBC, like The Guardian, PBS, and others. I think it's important to have it all kind of in one place, because I think a lot of people around the world are just sort of experiencing whatever they're being told in their bubble on Earth. And unfortunately, because of these echo chambers, we might be headed to a very bad place with nuclear escalation. As far as I know, Noam, is there anything in place to de-escalate once a nuclear or a tactical nuke has been deployed? Is there anything in the international law that can put the brakes on, let cooler heads prevail? Or is it all just making it up as we go along?
Well, there have been, if you go through, I would start even earlier than 2014, but that's a good place. But if you go through the detailed record, what has happened is constant steps in escalation, in making it harder to reach a settlement. This continues right up until days before the invasion. So I don't know if you're going to show this here, but Emmanuel Macron was trying, the leading statesman in Europe, French president, was trying very hard with some German support to reach an accommodation with President Putin that would fend off the war, the invasion. We have the transcripts of his conversation with Putin. It was published in a French journal. You can read them. And it goes up to 4 days before the invasion. Macron was providing options of the kind that are familiar, that I'm sure are there in your presentation. Considerations about neutralization of Ukraine, offering that, referenda in the Donbass region, efforts to move towards a Minsk-style federal arrangement, putting off the question of Crimea, as even President Zelensky has suggested. It's just can't deal with it right now. That's the basic framework, which has been pretty well understood. Putin listened, he didn't reject it, he didn't accept it. And finally, at the very end, 4 days before the invasion, he basically dismissed it with contempt. He said, sorry, I have to go off ice skating. Those were his words. Okay, he closed it off. Well, there are continuing possibilities. As the war continues, possibilities narrow. Both sides get more committed, harder and harder to find a settlement. It's the way wars work. The most recent we know of was last April. We have credible evidence that in April, there were Ukraine Russia negotiations under Turkish auspices, which may have been getting somewhere. We don't have details, but we do know that Prime Minister Boris Johnson flew to Ukraine and informed Ukraine that the US and Britain, he calls it the West, but it means US and Britain, do not want negotiations at this point. He was followed by US Defense Secretary Lloyd Austin. We don't have a record of what he said, but it's reasonable to suppose that Austin repeated what he has been saying clearly and explicitly for several months, which happens to be official US policy, that the war must continue to severely weaken Russia, which means no negotiations now. That's the most recent thing we know.
So look, we're going to go through a lot of this. And I do want to say that it's very reminiscent of the war in Afghanistan with Brzezinski talking about essentially the same sort of pep talk that you see here. Just want to play for you really quickly. This is what was said in the 80s, or I should say 1979. This is Brzezinski to the Mujahideen to fight the USSR.
U.S. National Security Advisor Brzezinski flew to Pakistan to set about rallying resistance. He wanted to arm the Mujahideen without revealing America's role. On the Afghan border near the Khyber Pass, he urged the soldiers of God to redouble their efforts.
We know of their deep belief in God, and we are confident that their struggle will succeed. That land over there is yours. You'll go back to it one day because your fight will prevail. And you'll have your homes and your mosques back again because your cause is right and God is on your side.
The purpose of coordinating with the Pakistanis will be to make the Soviets bleed for as much and as long.
Now that is Brzezinski himself. It cuts off there. To make the Soviets bleed for as much and as long as they can. Is that the calculus that you think is happening currently with the US and the UK, in the sense that well, Russia is now in a quagmire, and if they supply weapons endlessly, but not too good, the weapons can't be too good because then Russia will freak out and there will be escalation. But just essentially the same playbook as with Afghanistan to drag it out over several years, because in that war, as we know, 1 million civilians just died. A lot of people died, and there were foreign fighters, which they called the Afghan Arabs, and others coming as well for war tourism and all kinds of things. Is that the kind of situation that you see happening in Ukraine today?
There's a lot of similarity. And I should say that by now we have detailed information about Brzezinski's role and about from him himself, in fact, and about what was happening through the period of the Russian invasion of Afghanistan. First of all, we now have the Russian archives. They've been made public. They're discussed in detail, reviewed in detail by historian David Gibbs. So we have those. We have a detailed study from the highest sources of what happened, how the Russian withdrawal took place. A very important book by Diego Cordovez and Zelig Harrison. Cordovez was the UN official who actually managed to arrange and carry through the Russian withdrawal. Zelig Harrison is a leading journalist and specialist on Afghanistan, highly regarded. Their book is definitive. We have the Russian archives which support them, and we have Brzezinski's own testimony, detailed interview he had in France around 1988, towards the end of the war, in which he describes what was happening. All fits together. What it shows is, to put it very simply, in the words of Cordovez and Harrison, that the US was fighting Russia to the last Afghan. When this is put to Brzezinski, pretty much in those words, who takes credit for it, incidentally, he's not trying to get around it. He says, sure, I initiated Carter, I got Carter to draw the Russians in by military actions that would undermine their government. I'm very happy with what happened, try to drag it out. He's asked by the reporter, what about all the terrible things that happened to Afghanistan? And Brzezinski says something like this. He says, look, what is more important, weakening Russia or a couple of agitated Muslims? That's his phrase. Among those agitated Muslims are 1 million cadavers. But who cares? We were able to weaken Russia. It was a great triumph. So as Cordovez and Harrison put it, the United States was fighting Russia to the last Afghan. Well, let's come forward to the United States and Ukraine. You can now read high-level U.S. commentators, highly placed ones, who are saying the same thing. One of them is John Quigley. John Quigley was the U.S. State Department representative in the European-based international negotiations to try to deal with the world after the collapse of the Soviet Union. His primary responsibility was Crimea and the Donbass. Of course, been involved in it very, very closely since. Can't get higher level than that. He's recently said it's harder and harder to avoid the impression that the U.S. is in Ukraine, is fighting the Russians to the last Ukrainian. Same phrase. Chaz Freeman, highly regarded U.S. ambassador to China, Saudi Arabia, long-time member of the diplomatic corps, said the same thing. And it is pretty hard to avoid it. The U.S. policy is continue the war to severely weaken Russia, no negotiations. Virtually the entire world now is holding the opposite. The entire global south is calling for negotiations. That's true even in penetrating Europe. To take Germany, most important country in Europe, of course. Over 3/4 of Germans want to move right now towards negotiations, not the U.S. and Britain.
Where, Dr. Chomsky, where do you get this statistic from? Because that one I could not find on the internet with 2/3 of Germans or 3/4 of Germans supporting.
I couldn't hear then.
Where do you find this statistic from? The Germans supporting.
Statistics?
Yes.
The German press, polls in Germany.
Do you remember which ones?
I mean, I've cited it in print. You can look it up. I don't have them. I don't have it in memory.
I do. So I want to say, I want to just give some evidence for what you're saying in general. Russia has always been hearing from China and India that they would like to see a negotiated settlement, a diplomatic process take place in Ukraine. In fact, we saw that, like you said, the Normandy format. Many people think of Minsk agreements as only taking place in Minsk. However, as we know, Angela Merkel and at that time Hollande and then Macron got Putin together with the presidents of Ukraine, first Poroshenko and then Zelensky. They tried for years. And so that shows that France and Germany as well wanted to see an end to the war. Then we have the Pope, obviously out of the Vatican, just recently begging, here it says that begs Putin, but then right in the subtitle says, calls on Zelensky to be open to any serious peace proposal. I do want to cut into the substance, though. There are certain things that you say and some other people say, certain things that some people say that I don't see much evidence for, and I would like to ask you where you get it from. So there are two alternate stories as to why Ukraine walked away from the negotiations. I personally was in contact with some of the Ukrainian negotiators on Facebook. I have screenshots of people begging them to make a deal with Russia. However, SBU actually killed one of the peace negotiators. So they killed this guy, Denis Kireev, 45, amid the negotiations. I should point out he was selected by Zelensky himself. At the time, the ministry in Ukraine claimed he was a hero, and he was killed during an operation to defend the nation. But the SBU, which is Ukrainians' KGB, claimed that he was a spy. Regardless of what it was, the negotiations did not seem to be super serious because, as you could recall, the first few days they didn't even get to the city. They were venue shopping, where to go, and then they spent 2 hours or 3 hours and adjourned, and so on. But here is the thing that I saw that the negotiations started to become more serious in March, with Kuleba as well as Lavrov in Turkey, reaching almost agreement on almost every point, Ukraine not being in NATO and so on. But then one of two things happened. According to Ukraine's government, the Bucha massacres and war crimes that they believe occurred there, and that will come out in all of the investigations, we'll see, they made it super hard for them to continue because their people would just not support any sort of peace with such an enemy. On the other hand, you're saying that it was due to Boris Johnson's visit. of which I don't think we have any transcripts. What makes you think that it's more Boris Johnson rather than the contemporaneous events in Bucha that put a nail in the coffin of diplomacy for Russia and Ukraine?
I don't think that, and I didn't say it. I just described what happened. We don't know what the Ukrainian decision was, and it's not my business. I don't give any advice to Ukrainians. It's up to them to decide what they want to do. My concern is the one thing that I am able to influence, that you are able to influence, the acts of the United States. We understand that principle very well. So we honor Russian dissidents who are opposing the Russian war. I don't give a damn what they say about the United States or Turkey or anyone else. I want to know what they're saying about Russia. And by the same principle, we should be concerned with what the United States is doing, what is within the realm in which we can hope to influence. That's what I've kept to. No advice to Ukrainians. It's up to them. I can talk about the consequences, likely consequences of their decisions. That's just like talking about anything else in the world. So we don't know. We know that Johnson's visit informed the Ukrainians that the U.S. and Britain didn't like it. There's every reason to suppose that Austin's visit reiterated the official U.S. policy that he's been repeating over and over, that we don't have a transcript. What made the Ukrainians decide? I don't know. No possible way for me to know. And there's nothing I can say about it. All I can say is that this has been U.S. policy. U.S. policy, in fact, it's official. I don't have to make it up. You can read it. U.S. foreign policy is we must continue the war to severely weaken Russia. In fact, to weaken it severely enough so that we'll never be able to undertake any act of aggression. You think about that for 30 seconds, it means we must weaken Russia beyond what the Versailles Treaty did to weaken Germany, because that was not enough. So it basically means we've got to turn Russia into some kind of agricultural society, kind of like the Morgenthau Plan for Germany. That's official U.S. policy. I'm not making it up. I'm repeating it.
Well, the Versailles Treaty was very punitive by the French, because I'm sure they were not happy with their defeat by the Germans earlier. And, the French and Germans used to go back and forth with Napoleon. And so they imposed this treaty, reducing Germany's economy. This was after the First World War, reducing it to essentially there was sky-high inflation, as is famously known, and people needed jobs and so forth. So a lot of times we can get into it, but it seems that sanctions often radicalize the population. The population that is being sanctioned actually rallies behind their leaders. And that happens in Ukraine or Iran, that happens in Russia. One thing I want to say, it's not just Putin. Many people say that Putin is behind all this, that if you would take out Putin, then the next guy would simply end the war. And while that could be somewhat of a case, it's very rare even to see the United States do this. So you could say, for example, that Obama drew down the weapons in Iraq and the contractors eventually as well, perhaps. But in most cases, take, for example, the assassination of JFK. During the time of JFK, the war in Vietnam was just getting started. There wasn't a lot of action as far as I understand. But having removed JFK, his vice president, Lyndon Johnson, not only expanded the war in Vietnam, but also Laos, for example, where I think Laos was bombed more than any other country in history, according to the History Channel. More than any other country in history. A war that was arguably totally unprovoked and perhaps justified by only one thing, the domino theory, the theory that the US is at war with global communism, which to me sounds very much like denazification, which is one of the justifications that Putin gives, that he believes that if NATO expands, that presents a danger to Russia and its interests. Well, it seems to be similar to how the United States viewed the expansion of communism 3,000 miles away, not even on its border. So my point is, if you remove that, my point is that this seems to be a national thing rather than one guy, which people like to say Putin can't be trusted and so on. But in fact, a poll just came out now, today. Russia, there was a poll that Russia recognizes the referendums, for example, by an overwhelming majority. They consider it to be legitimate. Of course, this is completely the opposite of everyone in the West, which is just what I'm trying to say is it seems that the mass media over the years creates a huge echo chamber in these imperialist countries. And if you replace Putin, it could be that the next guy would be even more hawkish and launch a nuke, like Medvedev, for example, or this guy who recently passed away. What was his name? He had his own party, Zhirinovsky. So what do you think? Is it just Putin, or is this more of a problem of entire countries now beating the war drums? And why are they doing it? What's the point for them? What do they hope to gain from escalation with all this?
Well, there are lots of people who are making a career of reading Putin's mind, deciding what's happening in Russia, all based on almost zero information. I don't participate in that. I'm not interested in baseless speculations for which we have almost no evidence about what's happening in Russia. The limited evidence we have, it's quite limited and low credibility, is that Putin is surrounded by a pretty small group of hard men, tough guys, who he has under control, but might have their own interests and might decide to break from him, might well become more hawkish. That often happens, incidentally. There's extensive study of. So Andrew Coburn, good military historian, has a book called Kill Chain, in which he reviews the record of killing off of top guys in a government or cartel or mafia gang and so on. And what he shows is that typically they're replaced by somebody younger and tougher over and over again. So maybe that would happen in Russia. But as I said before, my concern is what I know something about and can hope to influence, not things I know almost nothing about, like everybody else, and have no effect on. That's the opposite of pretty much the way commentary and scholarship works. But it's a position we understand and respect in the case of enemies. It's exactly what we want enemies to do, like Russian dissidents. We just can't do it ourselves. Well, I prefer to take the same stance with ourselves. With regard to the Vietnam War, Kennedy and Johnson, I could run through the details if you like. I've studied it extensively, written extensively about it. I think that picture which you presented, which is the conventional one, does not stand up to the record. JFK was one of the extreme hawks in the administration. Johnson was hoping to keep from the war expanding. Events on the ground changed radically, and Kennedy's most dovish advisors were pressing Johnson to expand the war. Laos was even worse than you described. We know the details. U.S. high-level officials in Laos testified to Congress that the intensive bombing of the Plain of Jars, that's the most intensively bombed in history. The reason for it was that there was a temporary ceasefire in North Vietnam, and the Air Force had nothing to do, so they were sent to bomb the Plain of Jars. That's the testimony.
And also the secretive nature of the war in Laos, which is often called the secret war, to me is very parallel to this idea that Russia has within itself, calling it a special military operation. I understand that legally, if Russia is now, maybe we'll start calling it a war, they will be obligated to use whatever means to defend their country. But there were times when Russians couldn't even believe, couldn't believe that Ukraine is being bombed. So their own family members were calling. Remember, family members, because these countries are neighbors. It's not like the US, which flies 3,000 miles away in order to do some bombing. It's literally next door. And of course, they have to live with each other. And it's an uneasy peace, I understand. Many people dislike the Turkish Empire, for example, the Turks for genocide in Armenia, in Greece. A lot of the Christians resent, and even the Kurds, who sometimes participated in these helping the Turks, they resent the Turks. So I understand when a big empire is resented by Estonia, Latvia, Lithuania, Poland. Imperialism does not leave a good taste in your mouth. Czechoslovakia. However, it's interesting that the people within Russia did not believe, even their own family members, that it wasn't just the Nazis, quote unquote, that are being bombed. It was more indiscriminate than that. And I think the secret war in Laos against the growing threat of communism after a revolution we didn't like has huge similarities as well. And in this case, the U.S. being the aggressor, who is invading and bombing a country because we didn't like their revolution and we didn't like the kind of economic system and the kind of people that they would associate with after that. That seems to be very similar to how, and no less bloody than what Russia is doing in Ukraine with NATO. Is that an apt comparison?
We don't have to look to Ukraine and Russia to find that people in some country support the crimes and atrocities that their country carries out. We can look right here. It's astonishing. On the case of Laos, almost nobody knew about it, so we can't. I mean, I was actually there interviewing refugees from the plaintiff George, trying to get some information out about it. The person who did most was Arnold Cohen, late Arnold Cohen, did manage to get, who worked there intensively, finally managed to get some attention, but years later. But let's take today. How do people today in the United States react to the wars in Vietnam and Iraq? The Indochina wars were by far the worst crime carried out since the Second World War. The Iraq War was a radical violation of the UN Charter, murderous, destructive war, absolutely no conceivable justification. How is it reacted to in the United States? Well, I'll give you an example. Take the current issue of Foreign Affairs, the main establishment journal of international affairs. Relatively dovish by comparative standards. It's not the Atlantic Council, some super hawkish organization. It's moderately, for example, they do publish articles which break with the establishment position and call for negotiations. So, mainstream liberal journal. They have an article this month, not Arms Control Today. This is foreign affairs. They have an article by two highly placed figures, also kind of on the liberal side. One was active in National Security Council and so on, Fiona Hill and Angela Stent. The article is, of course, a major condemnation of Putin, the worst monster in history, and so on. And then there's a condemnation of the global South, the whole global South, because they don't go along with us in this war. They're keeping their hands open to Russia. They're refusing to take part.
Is it like we called the? Is it like?
Finish?
Sure.
Can I finish? Then they go on to say some leaders, some people in the global South are so outrageous that they even dare to compare Russia and Ukraine with the U.S. operations in Vietnam and Iraq. It's an astounding comment, which would be unbelievable in any civilized society. What they're saying is the two of the worst crime since the Second World War and another major crime were just benign activities. That's in the leading establishment journal. You're not going to see one critical word about it, except from somebody like me. So do we have to go to Russia to find out why people believe state propaganda? We're immersed in it. All the people we meet, all the scholars, all the commentators, all totally immersed in it. No matter how much evidence there is. Evidence on these things reaches the sky. Sorry.
No, I love your passion on this, and you have been talking about this for decades. And I think this goes to the heart of what I would like to talk to you about, okay? Which is essentially how the public supports these atrocious wars, and perhaps even wars that could lead to the extinction of humanity on a global scale, which is, you would think, insane. But I want to get into that in a moment. I wanted to just say that it seems that we even shame other countries. I remember when we renamed French fries into freedom fries because France and Germany refused to go along or support the US position on Iraq. And you don't even have to, people say, well, that was 30 years ago. That was 50 years ago. This year, the US occupation of Afghanistan ended with a defeat, by the way, to the Taliban. And of course, they say that they were a good presence there because they were helping girls go to school and get education, which is certainly true that they were doing that. But the Soviets were doing that too in the 80s. And the United States back then, instead of helping the girls in their education, let's say, the United States decided to fund the terror activities against the government of Afghanistan. But we don't have to go into history. Today, right now, this year, Yemen is in its, what is it now, the 8th or maybe 10th year, depending on how you look at it. And the UN says, right, outright catastrophe over rising hunger, right? And you've mentioned before that a lot of their food comes out of Ukraine. At the highest levels, we have the president of the United States, in this case, Donald Trump, said things like, where was this? Defends arms sales to Saudis, saying this will mean really, really many jobs. We're talking about 40,000 jobs in the United States. Look, an industry based on death and knowing how many people are suffering, to send weapons to that region, we justify it. We're justifying it now as well, with the hope that the Ukrainians will eventually prevail. But of course, we don't want to give them weapons that are too good to make them win too quickly, because then we might get a nuclear attack by Russia. So it's a very perverse thing to drag out this war for years in order to, as Brzezinski said, bleed Russia dry. Some people say the quiet part out loud. Trump does, Trump did, and so did Brzezinski. So I don't think everyone is pretending like they have good humanitarian reasons. Sometimes it's just about business and geopolitical rivalry, isn't it?
I'm sorry, I lost what the question was. You brought up many different things.
Let me get to the heart of the matter. For decades, you were talking about the body count. You talk about how, for decades, you, Noam, were talking about the body count. You
body count?
The body count. What I mean by okay. A few years ago, you had a dispute. Sam Harris messaged you to defend the new atheists, who you had described believe in the religion of the state, meaning, although they condemn the killing in the name of a religion like Christianity or Islam, they are more than happy to perpetuate messages that justify killing or collateral damage on a huge scale, millions dying or going hungry. And so Sam Harris said to you that you ignore the role of intention. He believed that the intention of the United States in all of these wars, or perhaps in some of them, was noble. And it was to help prevent a genocide, such as,
There's no reason to believe that the intention of the United States was noble. Of course, the rhetoric is noble, but the rhetoric of everyone is noble. When Hitler took over the Sudetenland, his rhetoric was just overflowing with nobility. He's going to end the ethnic conflicts. He's going to bring to them the benefits of the more advanced German civilization, technology, humanities, just wonderful. And if you had records from Genghis Khan, you'd probably find the same thing. So we don't pay any attention to the rhetoric. We look at the policies, and in the United States, we're lucky. It's a very free society, so unusually so. So we have internal records, extensive ones, and there we can find out what the goals were. So we look at the actual goals as internally discussed and the policies which essentially conform to them. But we don't look at rhetorical claims about intentions. That's just ridiculous. Of course, everybody has noble intentions in rhetoric.
Well, I want to put a little bit of more nuance to this, maybe another perspective that you and Sam Harris didn't bring up. When there is a federal union like the EU or like the USA or China or USSR, for example, then within that union, when something moves from one province to another province, that is considered administrative. For example, the last time that Crimea changed hands from Russia to Ukraine, right, in 1954, no one thought about killing thousands of people as a result, and certainly not escalating to a nuclear war between countries and a world war. Why? Well, it would be just as ludicrous to suppose that World War III would start by a dispute between New York and New Jersey. So I think that once the empire has been established, there are benefits to empires. It's not all bad. So one good thing is that, take the United States, right? We all speak English. When I first met you, I took public roads that went up to Massachusetts. I drove on federal highways. And so people, instead of fighting each other, have a common language, a common federal economy, and they're able to, and a common language and a common science, And so throughout history, empires allowed the science centers to prosper and to improve technology in the world. For example, paper, gunpowder came out of China, but China was a giant empire. Somebody invented it, and then it spread throughout the empire. So what I'm saying is, I think whether it's Pax Romana or Genghis Khan's famous piece that a virgin could go thousands of miles without being molested, I think by having a sort of unity that's already been built up, like the EU, it seems to be a positive force and a framework where the same exact event, in this case, transfer of Crimea from one political entity under another, is not viewed at all through the lens of nationalism and war and territorial integrity.
Great, I lost you. Are you proposing a justification of empire? So like you're favoring Nazi Germany taking over all of Europe? That would be empire.
Well, if you want to take the edge cases, I would say that if Hitler hadn't started killing people in a genocide and all that he did was annex Austria in the Anschluss, let's say, that's all he did, and then the economy improved, he would probably be considered a good leader if that's all he did. And that would be strictly better than Austria not being part of this economy during the time of a Great Depression.
We have to make a couple of distinctions.
Yeah.
There's a big difference between Nazi Germany taking over Europe and unifying it, and between the European Union, which is a union of independent states that came together to join for the common good. European Union is certainly much better than a lot of warring states. I mean, for centuries, the states of Europe had been slaughtering one another. So to move towards the point where France and Germany can be allies, and you can drive from France to Germany without going through a checkpoint, and a French student can study in a German university and so on. That's a big advantage over slaughtering each other. But that has absolutely nothing to do with imposing imperial control, like the Russian Empire or the American Empire or the Nazi Empire. These are just totally different things.
Well, perhaps I'm using the wrong terminology. Let's just say federal union or federation. However it came about, it's now, they speak the same language now, right?
Not the same language. European Union, dozens of different languages. In fact, it's very questionable. It's very questionable whether the move towards national languages in Europe is positive. Now, that's an open question. There are plenty of people in Italy, for example, who can't talk to their grandmother because of the process of Italian unification, which has wiped out dozens of languages. You can debate whether that's good or bad, but the European Union didn't impose a common language. It's keeping the national languages and much of the national cultures. Exactly how much? That's a matter of great conflict within Europe. One of the things that the European Union did was undermine democracy severely by transferring fundamental decisions away from the national states, where the public has some influence, to Brussels, an unelected bureaucracy in Brussels, the Troika, European Commission, European Central Bank, IMF. They're free. They're just autocrats. Don't respond to anyone. And that's where central decisions are. It's part of what you see behind the rise of the far-right nationalist movements in large parts of Europe, in Italy a couple of days ago. These are movements which in part are reacting to the undermining of democracy, of sovereignty, by moving decisions to an unelected troika in Brussels. So there's all sorts of problems. But these are totally different from imperial domination. That has nothing to justify it.
I guess, let me shift gears, because I want to ask you your opinions. I promised people that I would ask you a few questions that about your views to clear things up, okay? If that's all right. One is, Russia has been condemned on an international level by the UN. This year, the UN voted to kick Russia off of the Human Rights Council, for example, overwhelmingly. How do you view the UN's position on this vis-a-vis Russia? Does that mean Russia is the worst violator of human rights? Is this war uniquely worse than every other? How do you approach seeing that a majority of nations condemn Russia at the moment?
They should condemn Russia. Majority of nations constantly condemn the United States. Take a look at the votes on Cuba every year, 184 to 2. Two are the United States and Israel, which automatically has to vote for the United States. And take the invasion of Iraq. Virtually nobody supported it. Take, in fact, the U.S. invasion of Afghanistan, strongly supported here. There were international Gallup polls taken. They were kind of marginalized here, but they're there. Almost total opposition. People in the world said an intervention could be justified if it had been shown that they knew who the perpetrators of 9/11 were. But of course, they didn't know. They didn't know long afterwards, which meant that almost the entire world opposed the invasion of Afghanistan. Almost everything in the United States, overwhelmingly what the United States does is opposed. What Israel does with U.S. backing is opposed. UN can't do anything about it. Nobody ever suggested that the U.S. be thrown out of the Security Council because of its invasion of Iraq or because of the war in Vietnam or a dozen other things. The U.S. is just too powerful. Can't do it. If anything like that was done, the U.S. would destroy the United Nations. Everybody knows that. In fact, when the U.S. is the one country which has rejected a judgment of the World Court, condemning it, ordering it to terminate its acts of terror. Does anybody care? Does anybody even know? Who cares? So much for the World Court. Who are they? The New York Times took care of it when the World Court made its judgment. He said, who cares about the World Court? They're a hostile forum. Why are they a hostile forum? Because they condemned the United States for international terrorism, ordered it to desist. So since they're a hostile forum, we don't care. That's the New York Times, the liberals. And that's our country, okay? I mean, you asked before, why do the people accept that? Well, I'm not sure they do, and it's not my concern. My concern is with the groups that you and I are part of, the intellectual classes, the commentariat, as they're called, the people who write articles and express opinions, people who have high level of education. It's my circles, your circles. I'm concerned with them. You take a look at the population, it's a very mixed story. And I'll give you one example. At the end of the Vietnam War in 1975, everybody had to make a comment on it, and you had a whole range of comments. And we can read them. They ranged from hawks to said we were stabbed in the back by the anti-war movement. If we'd fought harder, we could have won. That's the right wing. You go way to the left, far to the left as you can go. Anthony Lewis in the New York Times, Dove, critic, anti-war. And he had an article which said, the United States, we entered the war with benign efforts to do good. Why? Because it's us. We don't have any evidence for it. So by definition, we entered with benign efforts to do good. But by 1969, it was clear that it was a mistake, and we couldn't bring democracy to Vietnam at a cost acceptable to ourselves. The most vulgar apparatchik in the Soviet Union couldn't sink lower than that. And that's the left end of the intellectual community that can be reached in the United States. Now, as it happens, there were studies of public opinion. Chicago Council of Foreign Relations carries out extensive studies of public opinion. So what was the public saying in 1975? 70% of the public said the war was not a mistake. It was fundamentally wrong and immoral. And that, as long as they asked the question, another 15 years or so, got the same answer. Then something quite interesting happened. The social scientist who runs the programs, liberal, good, solid social scientist, John Riley, finally asked, what do people mean when they say the war is fundamentally wrong and immoral? They didn't do a poll to find out. He just told us, because it's obvious. What they meant is they thought too many American soldiers were dying. Maybe, or maybe they thought it was fundamentally wrong and immoral. In our intellectual culture, can't even ask that question, okay?
Well, to me, that is the key thing. If you can value the lives of Yemenites or Libyans, then you would be talking about the millions that had to live in a failed state after our invasion of Libya. But instead, we only spoke about the 4 Americans in Benghazi. And the reason that we don't like the Saudi regime is because they assassinated Khashoggi, a journalist with ties to the United States, not because they're bombing Yemenites or millions of Yemenites.
It's normal. It's what we do to those other people just doesn't matter to the intellectual classes. About the population, I'm less sure. We have plenty of evidence to the contrary. So take during Reagan's terrorist wars in Central America, murderous terrorist wars. There was a popular reaction in the United States from the grassroots, not particularly organized. It came from evangelical churches in the Midwest all over. For the first time in history, in the history of imperialism, first time, people in the imperial society didn't just object, which is rare enough, but actually went to live with the victims, to help them, to give them the protection of a white face. It's an unbelievable event, pretty much wiped out of history. The intellectuals don't want to hear about this kind of stuff, but that's a popular response to the crimes of the state, mostly supported by the intellectual classes.
Well, I want to ask you about one other thing, the intellectual classes within Ukraine. I think it's important to understand that in each country, the media and the commentators really affect how people think. I want to play for you this 1.5 minute clip. You could see the captions right here, the translation, and I want you to react to it. This is the advisor to Zelensky. His name is Alexei Arestovich, and you could think of him as like Kellyanne Conway with Trump. Before he was with Zelensky, he was a commentator and a critic. It is in this capacity that he gave this interview in 2019. And this is what he said.
Получает выдачи в НАТО, то тогда мы можем говорить о каких-то сроках прекращения войны.
Нет, ни о каких сроках прекращения войны мы не будем говорить. Наоборот, это, скорее всего, подтолкнет крупные военные операции России против Украины. Потому что они должны нас будут просадить в инфраструктурном отношении и превратить здесь все в разваленную территорию, для того, чтобы нас неохотно...
То есть Россия сможет пойти на прямую конфронтацию с НАТО?
Конечно, Россия, не НАТО. Они должны это сделать до того, как мы вступим в НАТО, чтобы мы не были интересны НАТО. Перестали быть интересны, как разваленная территория. С вероятностью 99,9% наша цена за вступление в НАТО – это большая война с Россией. А если мы не вступим в НАТО, это поглощение России в течение 10-12 лет. Вот и вся вилка, в которой мы находимся. А теперь давайте выбирать Зеленского.
Подождите, а теперь если поставить чашу на весах, а что лучше в таком случае?
Конечно, крупная война с Россией и переход в НАТО по результатам победы над Россией.
Что такое может быть крупная война с Россией? Вот.
Это воздушная операция наступательная, вторжение российских армий, четырех, которые они создали на наших границах, там осада Киева, попытка окружить войска, которые в АТО находятся, операция Объединенных сил прорыв через Крымский перешейк, выход на Каховское водохранилище, чтобы воду в Крым дать, наступление с территории Беларуси, там создание новых народных республик, диверсии, удары по объектам критической инфраструктуры и так далее, воздушный десант. Вот что такое полноценная война. И вероятность ее 99%.
Когда?
После 21-22 самый критический, 20-22 самый критический.
In other words, he is predicting this, but his opinion is it's preferable to have a big war.
New reporting this morning, CNN has learned that the
it's better to have a big war in Russia with Russia, because he believes the alternative is that Russia will consume. He doesn't go into specifics, but consume Ukraine in 10 years. So that's the what is your reaction to this line of thinking?
I'm afraid this is another example of the distinction between us. Your focus is on other people we have nothing to do with, we can't influence. My focus is the same as our attitude toward Russian dissidents. We shouldn't be concerned with ourselves and what we can do something about. I don't happen to agree with his analysis, but it's not my business. Some Ukrainian says, here's what I think. Up to him to say what he thinks. You want to know my opinion about what he thinks? I can tell you, but I don't give him advice.
Well, he's the advisor to the president.
My opinion about what he thinks is that if Ukraine had moved directly to joining NATO, it would have been wiped out, along with the rest of us, probably. Okay? And he's omitting an alternative. Let's find a way to settle the problem without invasion. And there were ways. For example, the Minsk framework was a way. Now, he may say, I don't like that. Okay, up to him, not me. I am not in a position to order other people what to do. All right? I want to say that the United States should have been, us, you and me, should have been working to act to make something like a Minsk-style settlement possible and avoid any invasion. Instead of moving Ukraine, as we were doing, to be integrated into the NATO command with an enhanced program, they're Biden's words, not mine, an enhanced program to join NATO. Instead of doing that and interoperability of US military programs with Ukrainian ones, instead of doing that, we should have been joining with France and Germany to try to move towards avoiding any conflict at all. That's us, you and me. What Ukrainians say is up to them.
Well, that's my question to you. There have been so many people in the United States, people like Ron Paul, people like Tucker Carlson or Tulsi Gabbard, all across the spectrum, Bernie Sanders. There have been people, influential people within this country, like Bernie Sanders, talking about how the United States should stop engaging in these regime change wars. Hasn't worked.
That's
Hasn't worked.
A different story, totally different story. Sanders has very little to say about foreign affairs, but as you said, he's talking about regime change. That means aggression to overthrow governments. Yes, he's opposed to that. But I've heard him say nothing on the Ukraine war, which is relevant to what we're discussing.
Yes, my point is that for decades, you have focused on being a dissident and empowering other dissidents, and that's good. But my question to you is, where we are different is, if we are concerned about an issue, like let's say women's rights, let's say human trafficking, we should look at where it's the worst. And as an international community, we should highlight that for everyone in the world to see. For example, caste rapes in India, or how China locked up Uyghurs in camps. Those things, the first step is to highlight that. By navel gazing only at your own country, what if your country is Morocco? You would be wasting your time globally. You could be helping expose crime.
Let's make our difference clearer. I agree with you that we should, but you and I disagree on the focus. You say we should do it in the case of other people's crimes, but avoid our own. I say the opposite. We should be focusing on our own because those are the ones we can change. Yes, we should highlight women's rights suppression in Iran. And in fact, I made many statements. But even more so, we should highlight human rights violations in Saudi Arabia, because there we can influence it. In Iran, we can't. So I take the position of the Russian dissidents. We should focus our efforts on attention on things we can do something about. Your position is the opposite. We should focus our attention on things we can't do anything about, but we can blame on some enemy.
No,
that's what you're saying.
Just to be clear, you yourself
that's the
said
difference I see.
Your own.
I don't see any other difference.
Well,
I see no other difference.
Well, can I clarify? Your own quote.
I make strong statements protesting Iranian repression right now. In fact, the last couple of days. I hope you do too.
Of
yes,
course.
We should all do that. But we should pay, our focus of attention should be on what we can change. Okay.
Well, I happen to be able to change things without going through the US political system. Me personally, I have companies that you know about that build software for people globally. And so people can...
Fine, then use them. I have plenty of contacts abroad too, which I use. But the main focus of our energy, just accept the principle, the main focus are on what we can do. That's the opposite of the standard position. The standard position is we should focus on what we can't do anything about, but we can blame on an enemy. Let's take the Uyghurs. We should protest that. We should protest even more what we are doing to 2 million people in Gaza. What we are doing, you and me, that's what we should be focusing on.
Well, this is where I fundamentally disagree with you, if I may, Dr. Chomsky, is that as a libertarian, you are now able to create software for people to inform each other and to self-organize without the machinery of the state, even the one you live in. If you've been trying for decades to affect US foreign policy, I haven't seen any result. You've been the most...
Sorry, but you've seen many results. So
Sure.
we don't disagree at all on what you're now describing. If you can set up software which will bring people together, it's fine. I have no disagreement.
But it's deeper than that, because the people are relying on their mass media apparatus. We spoke about this before, whether it's state-sponsored like BBC or RIA News in Russia, or whether it's corporate sponsored and for profit, like you wrote about in Manufacturing Consent. You yourself said that it can be captured by the state, that there are incentives to tell the official story. I want to know what's happening right now in Mariupol. Are people fine? I want to know what's happening in Sana'a, Yemen right now. How can I know this given the current apparatus? I can't. It's completely distorted wherever I live.
A lot of ways to know it. You can read Al Jazeera. You can read international press. You can read documentary evidence. We can read the documents of our own country and find out that a lot of what you were saying just isn't true. So there's plenty of ways to do it. It's much better if you can find web systems to make it even better. I'm all for it. Who could disagree with that?
Thank you. I would love to help stateless populations. Like there's so many now. We're in touch with people who were part of the Rohingya genocide in Burma, which is now called Myanmar. We're in touch with their representatives. There were genocides all over the place. There's a Tamil genocide in Sri Lanka. You know, there is a genocide, just if you think of Bangladesh when it was trying to get independence. My point is this: if you rely on the state, if you rely on the idea that these flags and these countries are the last flag that will ever fly over a specific region, you're going to get people fighting over this idea. And like I said before, if everyone is part of one union, like the Soviet Union or USA, it's laughable. It's risible to think that New York and New Jersey could start World War III. But as soon as the union falls apart, you know, you're starting to get nationalism and flags. So my point is, if you live in one of these countries, whether it's a federal, big federation or whatever, yes, it has a lot of power, and you can try to move public opinion within it to curb most of the, try to stop the wars. But how much success have you seen? You've been at this for 70 years, and there, just in my lifetime, I've seen the Iraq War, the Libya, destroying Libya, Syria, Afghanistan. I mean, U.S. is at it all the time. So at least I think we need a non-state approach, we the people. What would you say to that?
I would say if you can find a more effective way, by all means do it. Who could object? But there's been the only means that have been available, and in my mind are still available, are the ones that peace activists are doing. And it does have an effect, plenty of effects. I can give you many examples. If you can do something even better, we all applaud. Nothing to debate.
So let me just, in that case, let me turn to Israel just really quickly. Israel and the current status of the Palestinian refugees. The definition of a Palestinian refugee is very important, because when we speak about who is a Palestinian, it's important to understand who are we talking about. And so they are defined as essentially Palestinian Arabs descending from peoples who have inhabited Palestine, but more by the UN definition, the people who were there in 1947. And so there was the Nakba, just for, I'm sure everyone who is watching this is probably aware, the Nakba, essentially there was, you could say, a civil war inside the inside Israel, a power vacuum when the British had left. And so during that war, there were many refugees. Now, here's the interesting thing. The refugees that came to the United States got citizenship, and now their children are born with U.S. citizenship, like Rashida Tlaib actually got U.S. citizenship and even got elected to U.S. Congress. On the other hand, in the Arab League countries, there is a policy to keep them stateless. So in other words, you could be born in Lebanon, you could be born there and your parents born there, but then essentially you're never given the same citizenship and the same rights. So if Israel gives a right of return to all Palestinians, they wouldn't be giving a right of return to 700,000 refugees from the Nakba, but rather every person that has even a grandfather, one grandfather from the Nakba has very limited rights. In Lebanon, just this year, they have again said that they're not able to hold professions a second time now this year. And even the Electronic Intifada talks about this starting from 2007. It hasn't improved. So if you are one of the people living in Lebanon, you don't have the same rights as everyone else. And Israel is the only country that gives you a way to have a life. You're going to move there. My proposal, again, just like with everything else, is to have a regional solution so that the Arab League countries simply offer citizenship to the people born there, just like the US does and every Western nation with birthright citizenship. And then after they just make that offer, see how many people take it. And then Israel can give a right of return, because then the people would have a real choice: stay in their country where they grew up their entire life or move to Israel. Right now, it seems like it's being exacerbated as almost like a demographic bomb, time bomb, which makes it almost impossible for any country, Israel, Jordan, Lebanon, to take in all of these people. It needs to be a coalition of countries that are cooperating. And I think we've started to see more of that, Israel cooperating with Arab countries, but it's only the beginning. I'd like to see more. What would you say to that?
Okay. As usual, you're omitting, you're taking the position that we should ignore totally what you and I are responsible for. There's a crucial difference between absorbing Palestinians in the United States and absorbing them in Lebanon. The difference is that the United States supports their expulsion from Israel. The United States is overwhelmingly responsible for the oppression of Palestinians. So it's not true, incidentally, in 1948, but it's been true in the last 70 years. You and I are playing a role in crushing Palestinian rights. So yes, therefore, in our, if we accept the U.S. racist imperialist position with regard to Palestinians, we're happy to welcome them here. In Lebanon, Jordan, other places, they don't support the expulsion of Palestinians. So their attitude is different. Now, with regard to their giving citizenship, you're pushing an open door. I've been in favor of this openly, publicly for years before you ever started talking about it. So you don't have to instruct me, but you're missing the critical difference as always. What you're saying is we have to ignore our crucial role. So yes, we should withdraw our role of supporting Israeli violent repression of Palestinians. We should also call for Lebanon giving rights to people in the refugee camps, as I've done often, including the times when I visited the camps and talked to Palestinians there. So sure, that should be a concern, but way down the list when we look at our actual concerns, which would be changing the US policy, which is day by day contributing to this massive suffering and repression.
Oh, I agree that the United States, I agree with you, Dr. Chomsky, I agree with you that the United States is perpetuating and making it comfortable to have, for example, a blockade of Gaza. But what I'm saying is the United States isn't the only actor here. Remember, Gaza was blockaded because the quartet, which included the UN, the US, Europe, and I think it was Russia, I forget, the quartet, they put sanctions on the country. And today, okay, Gaza is blockaded by both Egypt, where there was a military coup and still is being run by people there, and by Israel. Now, what I'm trying to say is I care about regional cooperation. So the leaders of the Palestinians, which you yourself said, you've seen it over the decades. The PLO was on the wrong side in the Kuwait war with Iraq. They sided with Saddam. Kuwait hated them. Arafat said they did worse than Israel to them. In Jordan, they had the Black September, where they literally took on the king of Jordan in a civil war, a state within a state trying to get power. They were kicked out, went to Lebanon, and started a civil war in Lebanon, which led to the rise of Hezbollah, a Shiite group trying to defend itself.
Look, I'm sorry, I'm going to have to interrupt because I have to leave.
Okay.
We could go on for hours with your repeating the standard propaganda line, condemning other people for what they do, sometimes correctly,
And ourselves,
sometimes wrongly. But what I am interested in, what we can do about it, okay? And in the case of every one of these things, there's plenty that we could have done about it. I could go through them if you want, but unless we can at least agree on principles, we go on forever. Yeah, you can give a long list of the crimes that other people commit, sometimes rightly, sometimes wrongly. And I am saying, let's talk about what we can do, okay? I'm sorry, but right now I have to leave because I have another commitment.
Okay, well, thank you, Dr. Chomsky. Perhaps next time we could have a conversation just about Israel. That would be great. Thank you very much.